Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, had long been known for his unwavering sense of honor. In every moment of his life, that honor shaped him, guided him, and often weighed him down like a mantle of iron. Yet it was also the foundation upon which the North had entrusted him with its care. From the towers of Winterfell to the frozen ports of White Harbor, his name commanded both respect and loyalty. It had always been enough. Or so he had believed until the first rumors filtered in that something moved north of the wall, something more fearsome than a mere raiding party of wildlings or the everyday troubles that the Night's Watch grumbled about. Darkness swelled, rumor by rumor, word by word, and an old fear began to awaken in Eddard's heart. He had been raised on the old stories. The Long Night, the White Walkers, the Night King. These half-forgotten legends of the North were usually told by hearth fires to frighten children or to pass the winter hours. But Eddard's father, Rickard Stark, had spoken of them as if they once might have been true, a cautionary fable that no man should dismiss entirely. Eddard had taken them seriously in his youth, then told himself, as so many do, that legends remain legends until they are not. The possibility of something stirring beyond the icy barrier cast a deep unease in him, heavy as a buried sword. He could not dismiss the warnings of the Black Brothers now, not when they whispered of shapes moving in the snow and men returning without eyes, without tongues, pale and dead and hungry for something more than mortal men could name. Word came to Winterfell that Lord Commander Mormont was worried that ravens had flown to King's Landing and beyond, but Eddard knew, better than any southern lord, how easily the crown's attention would slip from the troubles of the distant, frozen north. He had no illusions that the Lannisters or the Tyrells or even the crown itself would muster strong forces to protect the realm from nightmares few believed in. If the rumors were true and the old evils of the night were returning, the North might stand alone. And standing alone, it had to be strong. Winter was coming, as the words of House Stark declared. The time had come to prepare. How then to prepare? The North was large, both mighty and spare, with loyal lords who owed fealty to Winterfell and an unbreakable sense of unity when threatened. Yet Eddard knew that the castles of the Umbers, the Boltons, the Manderleys, and the rest were scattered across vast distances. Each had its own forces, its own militia, its own skill and steel. But if the tales were true, ordinary steel might fail against the threat in the far north. The ancient records told that Valyrian steel was potent against the White Walkers. Few in Westeros possessed swords of that rare, nearly magical metal. Fewer still knew how to create or reforge it. Even the Targaryens, with all their might, had kept careful count of the remaining blades. The secret of Valyrian steel's forging had been lost with the doom of Valyria, so the histories all claimed. But history is written by men, and men do not always know everything. Eddard's father had once collected old scrolls from across the sea, from Old Town, from half-buried vaults in the crypts of Winterfell. Eddard himself, in his youth, had spent some hours reading dusty tomes in Master Luwin's tower, discovering half-faded references to blacksmiths who had studied fragments of the Valyrian craft. Some claimed it was impossible to replicate, that the dragon's fire and the arcane spells required were lost to the ages. Others hinted that some secrets remained, scattered like shards of a broken sword across the known world. After the rumors of rising dread, Eddard returned to those texts, quiet nights in the library tower while the wind howled outside and his children slept. He combed through everything he could find, determined to see if there was any glimmer of possibility. He had no illusions that he could replicate the ancient forges in their entirety, but perhaps pieces of knowledge could be reclaimed. Perhaps something could be done, some technique revived. For if even a chance existed that forging new Valyrian steel swords was possible, and if such swords could fend off the horrors from beyond the wall, then it was his duty to attempt it. He began simply. Mikken, Winterfell's blacksmith, was his first confidant. Together, they pored over the texts, the old fragments that referred to foldings of steel, infusions of certain metals, secret heat treatments. Some knowledge contradicted itself. One scroll claimed that Valyrian steel required dragabone ash during the quenching, another insisted it was weirwood charcoal that gave the metal its dark ripples. Eddard's head spun with the contradictory accounts, but he pressed on. He stayed up late with Master Luwin as well, for Luwin was adept at reading old runes and half-smudged fragments. They discovered that, centuries ago, the North had once hosted a smith from Essos who claimed partial knowledge of the technique. That man vanished under suspicious circumstances, but not before leaving behind a short treatise in coded script. Deciphering the code became a nightly obsession for Eddard. He would send his maester for more references and attempt to piece together the puzzle. His nights became busier than his days, but he pressed on, fueled by a sense of urgency he could not fully name. In the day, he would see to Winterfell's governance, attend to disputes, ensure the training of men, the storing of food for the winter to come. But as dusk fell, he would lock himself in the library with Luwin or descend to the godwood for moments of silent reflection. Sometimes he would lay a hand against the massive heart tree as if the old gods might grant him clarity. Other times he would simply watch the weirwood's carved face, seeking answers in its eternal, sorrowful gaze. Another piece of fortune arrived unexpectedly in the form of Howland Reed, Lord of the Crannogmen. Reed came to Winterfell to renew his oath of fealty and to bring news of movements in the marshes near the neck. Strange sightings, he said, half-whispered over the hall's long table. Shadows in the water, men who spoke in odd tongues. Eddard guessed they might be sellswords or outlaws. But how they had managed to bypass the main roads remained a mystery. In private, over cups of ale and the warmth of the solar, Eddard confided in Reed about his pursuit of Valyrian steel's secrets. To Eddard's surprise, Reed showed no shock, only a thoughtful frown. The Crannogmen were known for lore the rest of the North had forgotten, for cunning approaches to the arcane and the hidden. I recall, Reed said quietly, that my father spoke of a traveling smith who once spent a season at Greywater Watch. He claimed to be descended from a line of Valyrian weaponsmiths. My father could never verify it, and it might have been the man's braggadocio. But he spoke of spells, Ned. You know we Reeds do not spook easily, yet something about the man's knowledge was genuine. Reed promised to search Greywater Watch for any stray notes or references. Eddard, with a heavy sense of hope, prayed that some piece of the old puzzle might be found there. In return, Eddard shared the partial code he and Luwin had begun to unravel, and Reed promised to see if the moss-covered crypts of the Crannogs might hold any cipher keys. They parted that evening in solemn determination. The nights grew longer and the days more chill. Riders from the Night's Watch brought fresh warnings about wights in the snow, of rangers found dead and reanimated. Eddard pressed his forging project with renewed urgency. At first, attempts to replicate the forging process ended in frustration. Micken hammered metal to a fine edge, folded it many times, tempered it in special oils combined with a pinch of ground obsidian found in the mountains near the Vale, according to references. But the resulting steel, while strong, was not quite Valyrian. It lacked that uncanny dark ripple, that almost living quality. Even so, it was better than ordinary castle steel, so they continued to refine it, adjusting quench times, forging temperatures, hammer rhythms. In time, Reed returned with a small scroll, half-rotted, bearing a symbol reminiscent of the Valyrian freehold. Its contents were nearly unreadable, but Luwin carefully worked to preserve it and read what was left. Enough was deciphered to add a critical missing ingredient to the forging, an infusion of metal from meteoric iron. Lore claimed that the freehold smiths sometimes used shards of celestial origin in their steel, forging cosmic fragments with mortal craft. That discovery alone reignited Eddard's hopes. And though the North had no known reserves of meteoric iron, rumors spoke of a fallen star in the far reaches beyond Last Hearth. Eddard wasted no time sending out discreet scouts. If even a trace of that meteoric ore remained, he would find it. It was around this time that certain lords of the North noticed Eddard's secrecy. He had not shared his project widely for fear that word might reach southern ears, or worse, the ears of men who might see profit in controlling such knowledge. But to unify the North, he would need their cooperation eventually. So, one by one, he invited a handful of loyal bannermen to Winterfell to speak of the matter. Lady Meage Mormont of Bear Island, the great John Umber, Lord Galbart Glover, Wyman Manderley, the formidable Lord of White Harbor. Each came curious and left swearing to keep the secret. Though many were skeptical that true Valyrian steel could be forged anew, the demonstration of Eddard's halfway steel impressed them. If there was even a chance to improve upon it, to create a new generation of blades strong enough to face inhuman foes, they wanted to help. Weeks turned to months, and Eddard's scouts returned with shards of black, pitted metal they claimed to have found near an old crater in the Savage Hills beyond Last Hearth. Micken tested the ore, forging small lumps into bars, folding them in with the high-carbon steel they had refined. The results were promising. The steel took on a subtle ripple, and when Eddard tested it by slicing cleanly through an old breastplate, the cut was sure, the edge unscathed. It was not quite the equal of Ice, House Stark's ancestral Valyrian greatsword, but it was closer than any man had seen in a century or more. The swirling pattern gleamed in the torchlight, and Eddard felt a tremor of awe as he held the blade in his hands. For the first time, he believed that forging new Valyrian steel was within their reach. There remained the question of forging enough swords for the North. It was no small task. Merely producing 1 or 2 swords of this proto-Valyrian steel had taken an inordinate amount of time and resources. To arm every loyal house with even a single blade seemed an impossible dream. But Eddard was a Stark. His father had always taught him that if a thing needed to be done, a Stark did it no matter the hardship. Slowly, Eddard began to put into place a network of forging. Mikken would train a select group of blacksmiths from across the north, men chosen for their skill, discretion, and loyalty. The houses themselves would provide raw materials, labor, and any lore they could muster. The forging would happen in secret for as long as possible. If the southern realms found out, they might try to steal the knowledge or sabotage the efforts. For once, the north's distance and isolation became its shield. When Robb, Eddard's eldest son, asked his father what occupied him so late into the nights, Eddard replied with a quiet smile, "I'm preparing the north for winter." Robb sensed there was more to it, but he did not pry. He had enough on his mind, leading training exercises, learning to rule. Sansa prattled on about Joffrey Baratheon and the possibilities of royal court. Arya was rarely to be found, off practicing archery or exploring the hidden nooks of Winterfell. Bran and Rickon were young, still in the realm of childhood wonder. Eddard recognized that if the rumors of the White Walkers were true, he must protect not only his people, but also his family from the horrors that might descend upon them. At first, the forging progressed slowly, but as the months wore on, the blacksmiths grew more adept. The swirl in the steel became more pronounced, the edges sharper, the blades lighter yet stronger. They tempered them in secret ways gleaned from the old texts, using water from the cold springs beneath Winterfell, quenching them in vats sprinkled with the ashes of rare woods. The near Valyrian steel took shape. Swords, daggers, spear tips. Each new piece was tested rigorously, hammered on anvils used to slice through layered shields. Those that failed were remelted. Those that succeeded were locked away in Winterfell's armory under constant guard. The first finished blade of note was a long sword Eddard named Winter's Promise. It was a gift of sorts for Miege Mormont, Lady of Bear Island, who had proven to be one of the greatest supporters of the project. When she held the sword in her hands, her weathered face glowed with awe. She tested its balance, gave a few experimental swipes. A grin cracked her stern features. "A fine blade," she declared in the quiet armory. "A blade worthy of the North." Eddard nodded, though inwardly he marveled at how much better they could still become if they continued to refine their technique. Miege Mormont left Winterfell with Winter's Promise strapped across her back, and the vow that any threat to the realm, be it from beyond the wall or from the Iron Throne itself, would face the fury of Bear Island's new steel. Word of this new forging spread among the northern lords, though only in whispers. They admired Eddard's determination, and many offered as much coin or resource as they could spare. The Umbers scoured the mountains near Last Hearth for more meteoric fragments. The Glovers sent huntsmen to retrieve rare wood from deep forests for the specific ashes needed in the quenching. House Manderley, wealthy from its trade routes, contributed coin for specialized equipment, forging hammers from distant lands. Slowly, the project evolved from a single forge in Mikken's smithy into a network that spanned the entire north. Indeed, forging near Valyrian steel became a northern secret enterprise. Inevitably, questions arose. Valyrian steel was said to require blood magic in some legends, or at least some manner of sorcery beyond mundane forging. Eddard would hear none of that. He believed that the combination of rare materials and expert forging was enough, though perhaps in ancient Valyria there had been spells to enhance the blades further. Spells or no spells, the steel they created was far superior to common swords, and if it could hold its own against the unnatural, so much the better. Still, a few blacksmiths voiced concern that some form of incantation or ritual might be needed to truly mirror the old swords. Eddard, ever honorable, refused any notion of sacrificing life or using dark arts. If the old Valyrians had practiced such vile deeds, the North would not stoop to it. Necessity demanded powerful weapons, but not at the expense of the North's soul. In time, as the forging process stabilized, Eddard realized he had enough swords to begin distribution. It was not yet a blade for every single knight or guard, but one or two for each great house, for each major castle. Enough that, should the worst come, each region of the north would have a champion armed with near Valyrian steel. He summoned the lords once more to Winterfell. The gathering took place in the great hall, fires roaring against the chill of the early winter winds. Warriors, lords, and ladies alike lined the benches, sipping mulled wine, sharing stories. But the mood was tense beneath the surface. Whispers of strange sightings north of the wall had grown more frequent. Several men of the Night's Watch had deserted after encountering things in the icy wastes. The old nightmares were creeping into waking life. Eddard rose from the high seat to address his bannermen. The hall fell silent. He spoke of the forging, giving credit to the smiths, to Master Lewin, to Howland Reed, to those who had contributed resources. Then he laid out the swords one by one across a table for all to see. The black ripples in the steel gleamed darkly, mesmerizing in the torchlight. A hush spread through the lords, a sense that they were witnessing something momentous. Each sword looked like living night, hammered and shaped into deadly perfection. Eddard explained that they called it northern steel, lacking the full knowledge to label it pure Valyrian, but that it was as close as any had come in centuries. "And I give these swords freely," Eddard said, his voice low but unwavering. "For the good of the North. Each great house shall bear one, to defend your people and your lands. Let it be a sign of our unity, of our vow to protect the realm." Lord Wyman Manderley, moved by the generosity, rose to toast Eddard, praising his lord's vision. Mej Mormont displayed Winter's promise for those who hadn't yet seen it, proclaiming it the finest blade Bear Island had ever known. Great John Umber, brash as always, boomed that he was eager to test this new steel on the skulls of his enemies. Others simply looked on in wonder, tempered by the knowledge that these swords were forged for a terrible purpose, the fight for survival against a threat they scarcely dared name. The lords pledged themselves anew to House Stark. Thus, the distribution began. Each house departed Winterfell with a precious sword as well as a blacksmith or two trained in the forging technique. Small forges would be established in discreet corners of each major stronghold. This was Eddard's grand plan, to multiply the knowledge across the north so that even if Winterfell fell, the forging would continue. All must be prepared. The old words took on a more urgent meaning: winter is coming. Despite these preparations, trouble stirred. Eddard received a raven from King's Landing. Word of the North's forging had reached the capital. The letter, penned by Grand Maester Pycelle but clearly influenced by Queen Cersei Lannister, demanded an account of all unusual metallurgy in the North. The Crown, it said, was concerned about unauthorized attempts to produce arms that might threaten the peace. Eddard read the message grimly. He knew that King Robert Baratheon, in the flush of his kingship, might pay little heed to such matters, but Cersei's cunning was never to be underestimated. She would not like the idea of the North forging advanced weapons. She might interpret it as a step toward independence or rebellion. Eddard's hand tightened on the parchment. If only Robert had the wits and will to realize these swords were meant to defend all of Westeros against a threat that cared nothing for who wore the crown. Eddard composed a careful reply, stating that the forging was part of the North's standard defense preparations, that no threat to the throne was intended, and that the techniques were still experimental. He swore loyalty, repeated that the North recognized King Robert's rule. But he kept many details close, especially the progress they had made. Above all, he omitted the possibility that these swords could stand against inhuman enemies. Some truths were better left in the North until the time was right. Then, with a silent prayer, he sent the raven on its way. He expected more entanglements from the capital, but to his surprise, none came for the moment. King Robert was too distracted by tournaments and hunts, and the Queen by her intrigues, to truly mount an expedition to investigate. For now, Eddard was free to continue his work. He was not naive, though. He knew spies might lurk in the North, or that the Lannisters might send men to glean the forging secrets. He thus advised each house to conceal its new forging carefully, to restrict knowledge of the blacksmith's craft. If a suspicious visitor arrived, the forges were to be closed, the swords hidden. Valyrian steel had always been prized beyond measure. This near Valyrian steel would be no different. The changing of the seasons weighed on Eddard's mind. The days grew shorter, and a bitter wind whistled across the courtyards of Winterfell. Piles of logs were stacked high, granaries filled, preparations made for a possible long winter. Yet, in Eddard's heart, a colder dread took root. He dreamed sometimes of pale figures crossing a white tundra beneath a black sky. He dreamt of the heart tree in the godwood, weeping blood. He would wake, heart pounding, certain for a moment that something was in the room with him, waiting in the dark. Then the dream would fade, and he would rise, slip on a cloak, and wander the quiet corridors. More than once he found himself drawn to the armory where Ice, his ancestral Valyrian great sword, was kept. Holding it comforted him somewhat, though he did not know why. Perhaps it was a reminder that the Starks had endured for thousands of years and would endure thousands more. One day, as the onset of winter loomed, a messenger from the Night's Watch arrived unexpectedly at dawn, his horse near collapse. He bore news of a skirmish beyond the wall. A patrol had been attacked by creatures with glowing blue eyes, impervious to ordinary weapons. Only one man survived because he had the presence of mind to wield a dragonglass dagger that shattered the attacker like brittle ice. Word spread rapidly through Winterfell's halls. The White Walkers were no longer just rumored. They were real, awake, and prowling the northern wastes. A hush fell over the castle like a death shroud. Men feared to speak the name, for the stories of old claimed these creatures brought death and an endless winter in their wake. But Eddard Stark did not cower. He summoned his council, gathered Master Luwin, the blacksmiths, and the men of the watch who had come. Then he took them down into the armory where row upon row of northern steel swords stood. He explained that these blades, made with meteoric ore, carefully folded and tempered, were likely their best hope against the walkers aside from dragonglass. Ice had been tested on a white once, or so legend claimed, and had proven more effective than normal steel. Valyrian steel was a known foe to the others. Would northern steel measure up? Eddard intended to find out. They would send a small expedition to meet with the Night's Watch, bearing several of the new swords. If the White Walkers were out there, then the North would greet them not with fear, but with steel. The expedition was a carefully chosen group. A few of the best swordsmen from Winterfell's guard, 2 from House Mormont armed with Winter's Promise and a newly forged blade, a ranger of the Night's Watch who swore to guide them through the haunted forest, and Jory Castle, captain of the guard at Winterfell. Before they departed, Eddard spoke to them in the courtyard. His breath plumed in the cold dawn air, swirling about the men who had gathered around. "Trust in your blades and your courage," he said. "Bring word back of what you see. The North stands behind you." They rode out, banners furled, leaving behind a sense of taut anticipation. Eddard could not shake the feeling that this mission was a turning point in history. If the new steel succeeded, the North would have a chance to defend itself. If it failed, the old horrors might wash over the realm. He spent his days anxiously awaiting word, his nights forging on with the blacksmiths, continuing to produce as many blades as possible. Masters at White Harbor and the Dreadfort had begun their own forging, albeit carefully hidden. Swords began to crop up in the hands of lords throughout the North. A quiet arms race, fueled by necessity, pressed on. Meanwhile, King's Landing had grown louder in its demands for answers, sending letters that inquired why so many shipments of raw iron, special charcoal, and forging tools were traveling to remote northern castles. Eddard deflected with half-truths. He cited the normal cycle of castle upkeep, the distances involved in the north, the approach of winter. But the letters became more barbed. Whispers from the south suggested that the crown might send envoys or, worse, Lannister men to investigate. Eddard dreaded that day. The last thing he wanted was for the forging secrets to fall into Cersei Lannister's hands, or for the crown to suspect him of building an army for rebellion. Even so, the forging continued. Fear of the others overshadowed all political concerns. Eddard's sense of responsibility to the realm eclipsed any desire to placate the Iron Throne. He would do what was right for the living, no matter how the Southern lords misunderstood. The North had always known how to endure, and it would endure again if it had the right weapons. Weeks passed. Then came the Raven from Castle Black. The expedition had returned, battered but alive. The letter, written in trembling hand by Jory Castle, described how they encountered several whites near a ruined wildling village and one White Walker, tall and lithe, with skin like snow and eyes of blue fire. The men had nearly fallen to fear, for the Walker exuded a chill aura that froze the very moisture in the air. Ordinary steel weapons were batted aside as though made of tin. But when the Mormont warrior swung Winter's Promise, the Walker recoiled, and after a fierce struggle, the blade bit into the creature's icy flesh. It shrieked, a sound that chilled the blood, and collapsed in shards of fractal ice. The near Valyrian steel had proven its worth, albeit at a high cost. 2 men died, but the rest escaped with their lives and the knowledge that the North had a fighting chance against the ancient enemy. A wave of relief and horror swept through Winterfell when the news arrived. Horror at the confirmation that the White Walkers truly walked. Relief that the forging efforts were not in vain. Eddard Stark exhaled, closed his eyes, and offered a silent prayer to the old gods. They had a weapon, but the threat was real. The respite, he knew, would be brief. The White Walkers would not be idle, nor would the undead horde they might raise. He had to accelerate the forging, share the knowledge further. Many more swords were needed, many more axes and spears that could pierce the unnatural. The entire north must be armed. When the men of the expedition finally arrived in person at Winterfell, Eddard greeted them in the yard. Snow drifted down as Jory Castle, pale and limping, recounted how the new blades could shatter the icy foe. The Mormont warrior, arm in a sling, recounted how the walker had moved with eerie grace, untouched by fear. Only the near Valyrian steel seemed to cause it pain. "I watched it die, my lord," the warrior said, his voice halting. It crumbled like cracked ice, screeching all the while until there was nothing left but melting fragments. Eddard took in every word, his heart pounding with grim certainty. The time for secrecy was nearing its end. The North must unite fully and openly, forging every day, every hour if possible. If the White Walkers spread south, it would be an apocalypse. Even so, Eddard knew the southern lords still scoffed at the idea. Maybe the Targaryens of old had some knowledge, but that knowledge had died with them, at least in the eyes of the crown. Worse, the Lannisters might welcome chaos if it gave them more control. He had no illusions that the North could simply rely on reason and pleas for help. They had to stand ready to defend themselves and, by extension, all Westeros. At last, Eddard called a grand assembly of all his bannermen. Hundreds gathered in Winterfell's courtyard under the frosty sky. Men from the mountains, men from the coast, from the riverlands of the north, from the swamps of the neck. All came in heavy cloaks, bearing their sigils. Eddard addressed them, not from the dais in the hall, but from the steps leading down into the courtyard, in the open cold, so that all could hear the gravity in his voice. He spoke of the White Walkers, the living proof returned by the expedition. He showed them the scars on the survivors. He had the near Valyrian steel blades passed around. Then he told them what he proposed, a united front, forging day and night, so that every man in the north might eventually bear a weapon capable of facing the others. A tall order, but the only order that mattered if they were to survive. The lords answered with roars of agreement. Great John Umber led a chorus of "The North Remembers," while Lady Mormont raised Winter's promise high, proclaiming that Bear Island would forge until the last of its iron was gone. Wyman Manderly vowed to fund the effort, to buy whatever was needed, to import even more exotic materials if that would help. Others followed suit. In that moment, Eddard saw in his people a unity and determination that transcended the petty politics of the realm. This was the soul of the North, a fierce will to endure. The forging effort became a mighty enterprise. Mines in the mountains were expanded. Meteoric ore was scoured from the wilds. Charcoal burners labored to produce special ash. Smiths worked in shifts, day and night, folding steel in the glowing forges. Castles from the last hearth to the white knife echoed with the ring of hammers. A powerful sense of mission spurred the men and women who toiled. Everyone knew the old stories were no longer mere tales. The White Walkers had returned, and the storms of the long night would not be far behind. The forging of 1,000 near Valyrian blades began in earnest. During this time, House Bolton, never the most loyal friend of House Stark, showed signs of hesitation. Roose Bolton, cunning and cold, seemed reluctant to fully commit. He sent fewer men to be trained in the forging, contributed fewer resources. Eddard guessed that Bolton might be considering how he could leverage the knowledge for himself, or even how it might grant him more power if the North grew vulnerable. Eddard, mindful of the threat that House Bolton posed, invited Roose to Winterfell for an extended stay, hoping to keep an eye on him and perhaps remind him of the gravity of the situation. Yet Bolton's pale eyes betrayed little. He spoke the right words about defending the North, but his actions remained half-hearted. Eddard resolved to watch him closely. Meanwhile, ravens flew from Winterfell to the Night's Watch, coordinating a plan to arm every Black Brother with at least one near Valyrian weapon. Their numbers had dwindled, but their fortress was the first line of defense. Eddard decided to send a contingent of Northmen to the wall, bearing crates of the new blades. Among those going was Eddard's own son, Robb, who insisted on seeing the threat firsthand. Eddard hesitated. Robb was still young, and he wanted to keep his heir safe, but he could not deny the boy's sense of duty or the importance of forging alliances with the Watch. So, with a father's mixture of pride and worry, he granted Robb's request. "Your duty is to our people," he said. "See with your own eyes what lies beyond. Return stronger, and share what you learn." Robb rode north with a retinue, leaving Winterfell in a swirl of banners. By then, the snows had come more frequently, and the land wore a mantle of white. Eddard watched from the battlements until the last rider vanished. He turned away, certain that his path was set. He would rally the north to face the oncoming storm, no matter how dire. As the forging spread, rumors also spread. Men of the north talked in hushed voices about the new Valyrian steel, about black-bladed swords that could kill even death itself. Far in the south, the great houses could not help but hear. Cersei Lannister grew more suspicious, dispatching spies in merchant caravans and alleged pilgrims heading to the shrines of the old gods. Some never returned, lost to the winter roads or caught in the labyrinthine north. Yet a few gleaned enough to confirm that House Stark was forging advanced weapons in great quantity. It was then that King Robert, urged on by Cersei and the small council, finally sent a royal emissary to Winterfell accompanied by a troop of gold cloaks. Officially, they came to inspect the realm's northern defenses and ensure there was no threat of rebellion. In truth, they sought to pry open the secrets of the forging. Word reached Eddard by Raven days ahead of their arrival, giving him time to plan. He ordered the forges discreetly hidden or at least covered. Many of the newly forged blades were smuggled to distant castles or stored deep in Winterfell's vaults. The blacksmiths who had the knowledge were told to keep silent or claim ignorance. When the king's emissary arrived, a southern lord named Harren Karen, flanked by a column of Lannister guards, Eddard greeted them with politeness but little warmth. Winterfell's gates stood open under a swirl of fresh snow. The southerners, huddling in their cloaks, seemed unhappy to be in such a cold place. Lord Harren was a plump man with watery eyes. He blustered about King Robert's concerns, demanded to see the forges, insisted that the North produce an account of all weaponry. Eddard, calm and unruffled, led him on a tour of the castle, showing him the normal blacksmith areas, the stables, the training yard. He showed them ordinary steel swords and suits of mail. "We have always armed ourselves, my lord," Eddard said. "The north is vast, the winters harsh, and the wildlings often trouble our borders. The House of Stark does what it must." At every turn, Harren tried to corner Eddard into admitting that advanced forging was taking place. Eddard played the honorable yet stoic lord, deflecting or downplaying. Lannister guards sniffed around but found no sign of contraband. The real forging was hidden in sublevels beyond a sealed corridor, behind a false wall disguised by crates and barrels. Even if they had found it, they would see only empty forges. Most of the actual forging had been moved to off-site locations. Lord Harren left Winterfell frustrated, though he could not claim Eddard had refused him. Eddard had shown him forges, metal, swords, just not the near Valyrian ones. Suspicion remained, however. Eddard was sure Harren's report to the crown would be riddled with innuendo that House Stark prepared for war. So be it. He had greater concerns. The night grew longer, the air colder. Ravens from the wall spoke of more skirmishes with whites, sightings of figures in the swirling snow. The great war horns had been sounded once, echoing across the ice. As if to confirm the threat, survivors trickled down from the northern villages, telling tales of entire groups found frozen and lifeless, their eyes taken by crows. The fear grew that the others might be massing, waiting for the coldest darkness to strike. Eddard spent his days rallying lords, coordinating forging, sending out more scouting parties. He made sure each major holdfast had at least a handful of near Valyrian weapons. The time would soon come when every sword arm would be needed. So far, no official southern help had come, and Eddard had no illusions that the Iron Throne would respond in time. The realm was decadent, rotting from within. Yet Eddard still hoped that if the threat marched south, the southern houses would realize the danger and join the fight. He hoped, but he did not rely on it. The north would stand guard as it always had. At last, Robb returned from the wall, eyes alight with new understanding. He had joined several ranging missions, glimpsed the desolation beyond the wall, and heard the chilling accounts from wildlings who had fled deeper terrors. He told his father how the Night's Watch was deeply thankful for the near Valyrian blades, how even a handful of them had changed the Rangers' morale. Robb spoke, voice trembling, of a fleeting shape in the distance, pale as moonlight on snow, a figure that melted away as soon as it was spotted. "I felt it, father. The cold, the malice. It made my breath freeze in my chest." Eddard listened gravely, placing a hand on Robb's shoulder. "You see now why we must do this." Robb nodded. "I do." Another few weeks passed in feverish preparation. Blizzards raged, burying roads, isolating holdfasts. Eddard worried about the logistical challenge of moving steel and materials in such conditions. Nevertheless, the forging continued, albeit slower. And then on one dark, frigid night, the horns blew at Winterfell's walls, one blast, then two, then three. 3 blasts signaled others. The watchers in the towers shouted of strange lights in the distance, shapes approaching from the direction of the Wolfswood. Eddard immediately mustered every man he could find, near Valyrian weapons in hand. They poured out onto the battlements, torches flickering, the swirling snow a blinding shroud. For long moments, the watchers saw nothing but the gloom of night. Then, movement, dark silhouettes at the edge of torchlight, with eyes like cold, pale fire. A vanguard of wights, animated corpses with dead faces, lurched forward. They wore tatters of clothing, their skin blackened with frostbite. The Northmen stood, hearts pounding, forging a shield wall. Among them, knights brandished the black-bladed swords. "Hold!" shouted Eddard. "For the north!" The wights rushed in a ragged mass, moaning, grasping with frozen hands. The clang of steel on bone and rotted flesh rang out. Ordinary steel weapons cut them down only for some to rise again unless fully destroyed. But the near Valyrian swords sliced through them more cleanly, severing limbs that did not move anew. Heads were sent spinning. Torches flared. The smell of decay and burning hair filled the air. In the chaos, Eddard spotted something taller in the gloom, a white walker astride a pale dead horse, carrying a long spear of ice. Its eyes glowed a terrible blue. The beast's breath steamed unnaturally in the air. Eddard knew in that moment that this was no mere skirmish. The others had come to test the defenses of Winterfell itself. The walker raised its spear. Ice crackled with lethal light. Then it urged the horse forward, gliding across the snow, silent as death. Eddard brandished ice, the ancestral sword. Nearby, Jory Castle wielded a near Valyrian longsword. They stood side by side, hearts in their throats. The walker's spear lashed out. Jory blocked it with his sword, sparks of frosty light scattering. A blast of cold rushed through him, nearly knocking him off his feet. Eddard moved in on the flank, swinging ice in a mighty arc. The walker twisted in eerie, fluid motion, but the ancient Valyrian steel bit into its flank. An unearthly shriek filled the night. The walker reeled and Jory lunged with his near Valyrian blade, piercing the creature's chest. The walker froze, cracked, then shattered into shards of ice that crumbled to the snowy ground. A roar of triumph went up from the Northmen who witnessed it. But the fight was not yet won. More wights kept coming. Another walker appeared further down the line, hurling icy darts that impaled men. The near Valyrian blades, though formidable, were few. Men rallied around those who bore them, forming defensive circles. Eddard called for archers to send flaming arrows into the horde of wights. Bit by bit, the enemy was pushed back. The combination of flame and black steel proved devastating. The White Walkers, not in great numbers this night, soon withdrew, melting back into the darkness as their wights stumbled to follow. The Northmen, battered, bleeding, froze in place, watching the undead host vanish into the swirling snow. Silence fell across the battlefield. Bodies, some fresh, some rotten, lay in heaps. Broken weapons glinted in the torchlight. The men were still breathing fast, hearts hammering, a stunned pall over them. But they had held. The line had not broken. The near Valyrian steel had made the difference, granting them the power to kill the walkers and keep the wights at bay. Eddard, arms trembling, lowered ice. Snow landed gently on the shards of ice where the walker had been, burying them as though nature itself sought to conceal the horror. In the aftermath, Master Luwin and the healers tended to the wounded. The bodies of the fallen Northmen were carefully gathered, heads placed separately to prevent them from rising as wights. The mood at Winterfell was solemn, yet there was a thread of fierce pride running through it. They had faced the others and survived. Eddard stood on the ramparts at dawn, looking at the carnage in the yard and beyond the walls. He felt a maelstrom of emotions. Sorrow for the dead, pride in his people, and a grim determination. This was only the beginning. The White Walkers would return in greater force. But the North now knew its steel could stand up to them. Word spread like wildfire across the north of the battle at Winterfell. Messengers carried accounts of how the black-bladed swords shattered White Walkers. The forging redoubled. Every house that heard the story realized the North was not dealing in rumors anymore. The apocalypse from ancient tales was upon them. The forging of near Valyrian steel, once a secret known only to a few, became a clarion call to every stronghold. Even the reluctant Boltons ramped up their forging, for they could not deny the reality of the threat. Smiths worked in shifts around the clock, ignoring exhaustion. Lords poured resources into the project. The entire North braced for war, a war unlike any the realm had known in thousands of years. Stories of the success also reached the south. They arrived distorted and exaggerated in King's Landing. Tales of Starks forging shadow swords that could kill inhuman beasts. Some scoffed, some believed, some were simply frightened. King Robert, hearing of an actual confrontation with White Walkers, demanded more information. But Eddard had no time for the crown's politicking. He sent a blunt missive that the others were real, that the North had proven it, and that the realm must unite lest all fall to the long night. King Robert was left disturbed and uncertain. Cersei Lannister, for her part, dismissed it as northern superstition. The small council argued. Littlefinger whispered about the political advantage or disadvantage. Varys alone seemed to understand the gravity, though he offered no direct solution. And so the Iron Throne remained paralyzed by doubt while the North readied for the storm. Widespread forging carried on through the worst of the winter. Eddard visited each major forging center, ensuring quality and morale. He traveled to White Harbor where Lord Manderley proudly displayed a new type of steel arrowhead that tested well against whites. He went to Deepwood Motte where the Glovers were stockpiling near Valyrian axes for their woodsmen. He visited the mountainous stronghold of the Umbers, saw men training in how to strike at the joints of whites and bring down White Walkers. Each journey reminded him of the North's rugged perseverance. He, in turn, reminded them to stay vigilant, watch for more raids, and send warnings if they saw the others gather in force. The great question remained, how many White Walkers were out there? The legends spoke of an army led by the Night King, but no one had seen him if he was more than legend himself. Eddard guessed that if the others had tested Winterfell, they would test other locations or gather a host of whites. The North must stand as one. And so he forged alliances more tightly than ever before. Feuds between minor houses were set aside. No one wanted to feud when the fate of the living was at stake. Months passed in a tense stalemate. Whites were occasionally sighted near the edges of the Wolfswood or a walker glimpsed at a distance, but there was no massive assault. The men of the Night's Watch speculated the others were biding their time, raising more dead, waiting for the harshest cold to give them the greatest advantage. Eddard used this lull to continue forging. What had begun as a dream of forging a few swords to defend the North had become a massive undertaking that armed thousands. Even common soldiers now carried near Valyrian steel spear tips or arrowheads, at least in the largest castles. Smaller holdfasts had fewer, but enough to arm a core group of defenders. The forging also changed the northern culture. There was a renewed sense of pride and identity. People looked to Winterfell with more reverence, acknowledging that Eddard Stark had brought them the knowledge to defend themselves in a time of horror. The smiths themselves became figures of admiration, no longer just laborers but pivotal keepers of the North's salvation. Some even whispered that if the realm survived, the North might never again bow so easily to a southern king. Yet Eddard pushed such talk aside. Survival came first. If that required rallying the realm, so be it. If the southern lords turned away, the North would fight alone. He would face that reality when the time came. One night, as Eddard walked the ramparts alone, looking out over the winter snows of the courtyard, he felt a presence beside him. Maester Luwin, who'd drawn close, had come to stand quietly. They gazed at the drifting snow together. "You've done what many called impossible, my lord," Luwin said. "You gave the North near Valyrian steel. You may well have saved thousands of lives." Eddard nodded, though he felt no triumph, only a grave acceptance of duty. "Perhaps. I only hope it is enough. The darkness that stirs beyond the wall, we've only seen a fraction of its might, I think." Luwin's face was solemn. "Even so, it is more than men have had in centuries. And you've done it without sacrificing your honor." He paused. "That is no small thing, my lord." Eddard did not reply immediately. He thought of the forging, the secrecy, the half-truths told to the crown, the frantic effort to gather rare materials. It had all weighed on him, but he had not broken from his moral path, had not spilt innocent blood in the name of forging more powerful weapons, had not employed black magic or vile arts. This was steel born of skill and knowledge, shaped by the hands of hard-working smiths, guided by duty and necessity. If the old gods judged him, he prayed they would find him worthy. In those quiet minutes on the wall, Eddard made his final resolve: if the war came in earnest, he would lead the North's armies personally. He would ride out with ice in hand, flanked by lords carrying the near Valyrian swords. He would not wait idly for the others to encircle them. The North would stand in the open field, if need be, or in the mountain passes, wherever they could best hamper the undead host. And if the war demanded a sacrifice, he would offer himself before letting his people fall. Before dawn the next day, a raven arrived from Castle Black. The Night's Watch had spotted a great host of wights moving across the haunted forest, led by several White Walkers. They were heading south. The war had begun in earnest. Eddard ordered the horns to blow, summoning every lord within riding distance to muster at Winterfell. Ravens flew to the far corners of the north, calling banners to converge. For the first time in centuries, the North prepared to march as a unified, fully armed force, wielding near Valyrian steel as their shield against the apocalypse. In the courtyard, men hurried about preparing supplies and gear. War horses were saddled, wagons loaded with rations. The blacksmiths completed final touches on swords and spears. Lords arrived daily, streaming in from every corner: Mormont, Glover, Serwyn, Tallhart, Manderley, Reed, and even Bolton, albeit with fewer men than Eddard had hoped. Some smaller houses that had seldom come to Winterfell arrived with renewed vigor, bearing their brand-new black-bladed arms. In a matter of days, Winterfell's courtyard swelled with thousands of warriors. The banners of the direwolf, the bear, the White Harbor merman, the giant of Houseumber, and many more snapped in the icy wind. It was a stirring sight, the greatest assembly of northern might in living memory. And at their head, Eddard Stark prepared to lead them. He stood in the Godwood one last time before departure, kneeling by the heart tree. A fresh snowfall coated the ancient roots. He thought of his family: Catelyn, Sansa, Arya, Bran, Rickon, even Jon at the Wall, and Robb, who would ride at his side. He prayed for their safety. He prayed for victory. Then he rose, brushed the snow from his cloak, and returned to the yard where his horse was saddled and ice waited at his hip. He addressed the assembled lords in a booming voice: "We ride to face the dead. This is not a war of pride or conquest. It is a war for the living. The North has always stood strong when united. Now we carry the finest steel the world has seen since the days of Valyria. Let that steel be the shield that guards the realms of men. For the North." The answering roar shook the very walls of Winterfell. Thousands of voices, one purpose. That same day they marched northward, banners streaming, hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The land was locked and cold, the roads thick with ice. Some men grumbled at the conditions, but these were Northmen, hardy and used to hardships. They trudged on. Scouts rode ahead, swift outriders scanning for signs of the enemy. Reports from the Night's Watch placed the undead host somewhere in the open wilderness between the Wall and Winterfell. It was a measure of ill fortune that the others had chosen a more direct southern route, rather than simply trying to cross the Wall. But to Eddard, it was a blessing that they might meet this threat away from the major population centers if they timed it right. Riders came galloping back one morning, breath pluming, with news that a great mass of wights had been sighted near the banks of a half-frozen river. Among them at least 3 White Walkers on pale horses. Eddard called a council of war in his tent, gathered around a rough map. The Umbers, the Mormonts, the Glovers all studied the reports. They had perhaps a day to position themselves. Eddard proposed a pincer move: half the force would circle around to higher ground with archers, the other half would form a shield wall bristling with black-bladed spears. Their best swordsmen, those wielding near Valyrian swords, would be placed in strategic positions to strike at any walkers. Fire would be used liberally to disrupt the wights. At dawn of the next day, the northern force advanced to the chosen battlefield. Snow swirled across the broken land. Through the gloom, the undead host appeared like a plague of shadows. The smell of death and cold sweat mingled in the frosty air. Eddard felt his heart pound. This was it, the moment all their forging and preparations had led to. He raised a hand, signaled the archers. Arrows flew. Many struck rotting flesh or rattling bone, bringing down wights. Then the wights surged forward in a tide of gnashing teeth and outstretched hands. The shield wall braced. The front lines smashed together in a cacophony of steel and bone. Men grunted, wights hissed. The black-bladed weapons cleaved through undead flesh, preventing them from reconstituting. Flames from oil-soaked arrows set the ground ablaze in places, halting the undead advance. Then the White Walkers appeared, gliding on their pale steeds. Their presence was tangible, a wave of cold that made men's breath frost on their beards. They attacked with spears of ice or swords that radiated a chill aura. Here, the northern steel would be truly tested. Warriors with near Valyrian blades converged on each walker, hacking at the ephemeral armor they wore. The walkers fought back with superhuman grace, parrying or evading. Some men fell, their weapons shattered or their bodies frozen. But others found the mark, slicing into the walkers and causing them to crack like glass, shrieking into nothingness. Eddard himself confronted a tall walker with a helm of ice shaped like a crown. Its eyes glowed fiercely, reflecting an ancient malice. Ice clashed against an ice-forged sword, sending shards of frost spinning through the air. Eddard gritted his teeth. Each blow sapped his warmth as though the cold was leeching life from him. But he pressed forward, calling upon every ounce of skill and determination. At last, he saw an opening and swung ice in a wide arc, severing the walker's torso. The creature let out a sound like wind screaming across a frozen lake, then imploded into jagged shards that melted upon hitting the bloody snow. Behind them, the battle raged. The North's lines held, anchored by men armed with the black steel. Bolts of crossbow fire soared overhead. Warhorns bellowed. Pockets of whites tried to flank the shield wall, but were met with cavalry armed with near Valyrian lances. The whites, mindless, flung themselves upon steel and flame, reeling and collapsing under the onslaught. Gradually, inexorably, the undead tide began to falter. The White Walkers, seeing more of their brethren shattered by the black steel, pulled back. Their pale horses whirled, retreating into a haze of swirling snow. Lacking direction, the remaining whites crumbled under the northern assault. At last, the field was silent except for the whimpering of the wounded and the crackle of dying flames. Broken bodies, both living and dead, lay scattered across churned snow. The stench of decay clung to the frigid air. Eddard forced himself to remain upright, ignoring the ache in his limbs and the numbness in his fingers. They had won a great victory. The forging had proven its worth beyond doubt. The White Walkers could be beaten so long as the men of the North bore these new blades and stood fast with unity and valor. Cheers broke out among the survivors. They lifted their swords to the sky, battered shields raised in triumph. For the North, they cried, voices echoing into the cold expanse. Eddard Stark allowed himself a moment of exhaustion and relief. Robb found him, eyes shining, and clasped his father's hand. Around them, men hailed Eddard as the savior of the North, praising his forethought in forging the new steel. Yet Eddard felt only a sober satisfaction. The war was not over. The others would regroup. The deeper winter might yet bring an even more massive horde, possibly led by the Night King himself if he existed. But for now, at least, the men of the North had bloodied the other's nose and proved that these ancient monsters were not invincible. The forging had given them a fighting chance. And in the uncertain darkness of the long night, even a fighting chance was a priceless gift. So it was that House Stark and the Lords of the North continued onward, forging alliances, forging steel, forging hope in the face of the darkest legends. Eddard Stark, once content to be a humble warden, had become the architect of the North's salvation. His honor had guided him, his love for his people had fueled him, and the old gods had watched over him. If winter was indeed coming, so too was the North's answer. A legion of black-bladed swords, united behind the banner of the dire wolf, ready to stand between the living and the endless night. The story of Eddard Stark's forging of near Valyrian steel for all the northern lords would be told in the ages to come. How the North overcame centuries of lost knowledge, how they toiled in the cold for a higher purpose, and how they faced the White Walkers in open battle with courage and unity. In the annals of northern history, it would be said that when the cold winds rose and the dead marched, House Stark gave the gift of fire and steel to its people, so they might hold the dawn against the encroaching night. And though more battles lay ahead, and the road would be fraught with peril, the North stood resolute. For winter was coming, but so were the swords that could shatter the shadows themselves. Eddard Stark stood in the silent aftermath of the battle, the cold wind carrying the tang of blood and the charred remains of the whites. Drifts of snow and ash mingled on the ground, and the scattered bodies of fallen men and undead littered the field beyond Winterfell's walls. The sky, overcast and heavy with further promise of snow, pressed down in an iron-gray dome. Though the North had won a victory this day, had shattered White Walkers and burned their whites, the price lay at Eddard's feet in the form of torn cloaks, twisted shields, and men who would never draw breath again. In the distance, he could still hear the low moans of the dying, the curses of the injured, and the shouts of maesters and healers attempting to save those who yet clung to life. He wiped his brow with the back of one gauntlet hand, every muscle aching from the strain of the fight. He had felt the chill of that White Walker's sword, a cold so deep it had seemed to slice into his bones rather than just his armor. Ice, the ancestral greatsword of House Stark, had once again proven itself. The near Valyrian weapons the North had forged, this new black steel that men dubbed Northern Steel or Winter Steel, had also done their part. He could see the relief in the eyes of the survivors, see the awe on their faces. The others were not invincible. They could be fought and defeated, But they were cunning, and Eddard had no illusions that this would be the last battle. In fact, he feared far worse was yet to come. He moved through the aftermath, stepping around ragged mounds of corpses. Some of the dead were already being piled for burning, for it was crucial that no corpse remain unburned lest it rise again in service of the others. Smoke from several small pyres drifted in the biting wind, carrying a sickly stench that made many men retch. Eddard's jaw was set as he surveyed it all. This was what he had tried to prepare for when he had launched his secret forging campaign. The North was far from saved, but at least it was armed. Every day, more weapons were being hammered into shape in hidden forges from the Neck to the Bay of Seals. And more swords would be needed, thousands more. The memory of how the White Walkers had almost swept over their lines kept him grimly focused. He found himself drawn to the wounded. There, on a makeshift pallet, Jory Castle lay propped against a broken cart, a bruise under his right eye and a bandaged gash across his forearm. Eddard knelt at his side, resting one hand on Jory's shoulder. Jory looked up, tried to muster a respectful nod. "My lord," he rasped. "We held them, though they came on like a frozen wind. If not for the new swords." Eddard nodded. "You did well. All of you." He glanced at Jory's near Valyrian longsword, set carefully aside on the ground. It still carried a faint frost-like sheen on the blade from where it had struck the others. "Rest and heal. We'll need your arm again before this war is done." Jory managed a weary grin. "I'll be on my feet soon enough, my lord. If they come again tonight, I'll stand with you." A fatherly warmth kindled in Eddard's chest, mixed with sorrow at the cost these men were paying. "Rest," he repeated. Jory nodded obediently, though Eddard could sense the man's pride in having helped stave off the others. Pride, Eddard thought, that was well-earned but dangerous if it turned to overconfidence. These were small victories and the others possessed ancient malice as patient as the winter's night. Robb Stark approached, helmet tucked beneath his arm. Snow clung to his auburn hair, his breath coming in ragged puffs. Despite the boyish lines in his face, he was still but a youth. He carried himself with the gravity of a commander. "Father," he said, dipping his head, "we've driven them back for now, but the scouts say they're withdrawing north, regrouping in the deeper forest. There's no sign they'll come again before nightfall. Should we pursue?" Eddard studied the boy. No, not a boy anymore, but a young man tempered by recent horrors. He put one hand on Robb's shoulder. "No. We have injured to tend to, and the roads are thick with snow and ice. The Whites have no need of warmth or rest. A pursuit would be in their favor. Better we fortify Winterfell and see to the wounded. We'll send out fresh scouts to track their position, but chasing them blindly is folly." Robb swallowed, clearly wrestling with frustration. "Yes, father. It's just, they might be preparing for another strike." "They might," Eddard said softly. "But we can't let them lure us into the shadows, separated and vulnerable. We hold here, consolidate, and see who else can join us." In truth, Eddard half expected more of his banner men to arrive. Word had spread that the White Walkers were on the move. He expected men from House Serwyn, House Tallheart, and some from Torrens Square. Perhaps, if the southern roads were passable, even some men from House Reed might come. But traveling in these frigid conditions was perilous. As if summoned by Eddard's thoughts, a horn sounded from the western gate. Men turned to see a small column of riders approaching, their cloaks tattered and white with frost. The sigil on the foremost banner was indistinguishable from a distance, but as they drew near, Eddard recognized the tall pine of House Glover. The men of Deepwood Motte had come, though in fewer numbers than Eddard had hoped. Their leader, Galbart Glover, dismounted in the courtyard, and Eddard strode to meet him with Robb at his side. The older man took Eddard's hand in a firm grip. "We came as soon as we could, my lord. The roads are near impassable, and we had to fight off a pack of Whites near the Wolfswood. Lost half a dozen good men. You're here, that's what matters," Eddard said. "Come, warm yourselves. We have injured and dead to tend. We've driven off the others for the moment." Galbart's expression darkened. "So it's true, then? The others themselves have attacked Winterfell?" Robb answered, voice tight with anger. "They have. We struck them down with near Valyrian blades. It's the only thing that works, steel and fire. But they'll be back." Galbart exhaled. "Seven hells, or the old gods help us, I should say. Well, then Deepwood Motte stands ready. We brought what steel we could." He gestured to a small cart behind them, where 8 near Valyrian longswords were bundled carefully in thick furs. "We forged them as fast as possible. Eddard nodded gratefully, though he could see the weariness in the Glover men's eyes. Your efforts may save many lives. We'll integrate those swords into the ranks tonight. I'll see that your men have rest and hot food. You've come at a difficult hour. The next hours blurred as Winterfell's courtyard filled with more arrivals. Some in small bands, some wounded stragglers from the outlying villages seeking refuge behind the walls. Each face seemed etched with fear and cold. Eddard walked among them, speaking quiet words of comfort, though comfort felt in short supply. He was painfully aware that Winterfell could not shelter everyone in the north, nor could the keep stores feed an indefinite influx of refugees. But he could not turn them away, not when the others might prey on the unprotected. He ordered extra rationing and had stewards set up tents in the outer ward to house newcomers. The hustle of preparations never stopped. Night fell slowly, as though the sun fought to linger above the horizon. The sky turned a deep bruised purple before surrendering to the dark. Eddard summoned his chief commanders to the great hall, which glowed with torches and a roaring hearth fire. There, Robb, Galbart Glover, Lady Meage Mormont, who had arrived earlier in the winter with a troop of fierce Bear Island warriors, the great John Umber, Wyman Manderly's representative, for the Lord himself was still at White Harbor, organizing ships and forging efforts, and a half-dozen others gathered around a long oaken table piled with maps. The air was heavy with the smell of soot and damp wool cloaks. Eddard laid out the situation as plainly as he could. The others had come in force, testing Winterfell's mettle. The watchers on the outer roads had spotted smaller bands of whites shambling across farmland and prowling near deserted hamlets. The primary horde had retreated northward, but no one doubted it would return. Everyone studied the maps by flickering candlelight, marking places where skirmishes had taken place. Eddard tapped a spot near the King's Road. Here is where the road meets the White Knife. We have partial fortifications in place, but it's not enough to hold off a mass of whites if they strike from multiple angles. Meage Mormont, still wearing her bear fur cloak, her face lined from years of harsh living, crossed her arms. We can't defend every village. The best we can do is fortify key points and funnel refugees there. We're forging as fast as we can, but men need training to use these black blades effectively. Otherwise, they'll be easy prey. The Great John, huge hands resting on the table, nodded vigorously. And we'll need to rotate men out. Fighting in this cold, it's not like facing a human foe. You get tired faster. And those whites never tire at all. Galbart Glover spoke. What about supplies, my lord? We can't keep men fed indefinitely in one place. Not with winter deepening. Wyman Manderly's representative cleared his throat. He was a younger cousin of Manderly, broad around the waist, wearing a cloak of deep green. White Harbor is sending grain by mule and cart to certain strongholds, but the weather slows everything. If the others push further, we may have to resort to emergency measures. Eddard listened carefully. His gaze flicked to Robb, who spoke up, voice steady despite the tension in the air. What if we create supply caches in strategic locations? Large barns or cellars stocked with food, near good vantage points. We can station men with near Valyrian steel to protect them. If the undead come, we retreat in an organized manner, falling back to the next stronghold, burning behind us so they gain nothing but ashes. A murmur of approval passed around the table. Eddard noted the methodical tone of his son's suggestion. Robb had grown sharper, more confident, and had begun thinking like a war leader. Eddard felt a pang of both pride and worry. A scorched earth approach might work, Eddard said. But we risk losing farmland and homes if the winter recedes. Still, we have little choice. Better to lose farmland than lose the north entirely. Meage Mormont curled a hand into a fist. We will do what we must. I'll see that Bear Island's men spread word to outlying villages. If they cannot fight, they must flee and gather in larger groups. That will make them easier to protect. Eddard looked around, the firelight dancing across solemn faces. Each leader bore the weight of their own corner of the north, but all recognized that only united action could save them. This was no time for petty quarrels. Even House Bolton, through its token presence, had contributed some forging. Eddard expected them to do more, but that was a separate concern. They planned late into the night, finalizing a strategy of layered defenses. They would identify key strongholds across the north: Winterfell, the Last Hearth, Bear Island, White Harbor, Deepwood Motte, Barrow Tun, the Dreadfort, and a handful of others. Each was to be supplied with caches of winter steel weapons and training. Each would be prepared to house refugees. Roving patrols of cavalry armed with near Valyrian spear tips would move between these strongholds, scouting and responding to white sightings. Above all, every lord agreed to maintain open lines of communication via ravens day or night so that if the others concentrated their forces in one region, reinforcements could be dispatched. By the time Eddard adjourned the council, dawn's faint light was already gray in the windows. They had to settle for a few hours' rest, if any, before once again bracing for the next threat. Eddard himself went to the godwood, alone, seeking a moment of reflection. The heart tree stood in silent vigil, its ancient face carved into sorrow. The red leaves stirred in a slight breeze. Eddard placed one hand on the cold bark, feeling a quiet communion with the old gods. He didn't pray for victory, exactly. He prayed for the strength to make the right choices, to preserve the lives entrusted to him. He prayed that the forging of near Valyrian steel and the unity of the North would be enough. In the hush of the godwood, he found no easy answers, only the sense that the old powers watched, distant and inscrutable. He returned to the castle. Servants rushed about distributing porridge and bread to the men who had toiled through the night. Eddard forced himself to eat a little, though his stomach clenched at the thought of the battles to come. He knew he needed strength. Around him, war-weary men gulped down whatever sustenance they could before returning to the ramparts or the training yard. Smiths were already stoking the forges again, hammering out more black steel arrowheads and spear points. There was no respite in sight. As the day dragged on, ravens came in rapid succession. House Reed sent word that the swamps of the Neck were stirring with unnatural creatures that lurked in the bogs. Crannogmen had managed to ward them off with fire, but more help would be needed if a large force of whites appeared. House Serwyn reported an attack on a minor hamlet near the road, all the inhabitants slaughtered or carried off. Only footprints in the snow and dark bloodstains remained. Some hamlets, Eddard knew, would be beyond aid. The sheer vastness of the north made it impossible to protect every homestead. The knowledge burdened him heavily. He organized new patrols, sending them out from Winterfell with as many near Valyrian weapons as he could spare. The sounds of departure became routine, the clatter of hooves, the jingle of steel, the harsh breath of men who knew they might not return. And still, more refugees trickled in, exhausted travelers who had seen horrors in the silent forests, shambling shapes by moonlight, eyes of blue fire. They brought children half-frozen, mothers with hollow eyes who had lost husbands or fathers in a white attack. Winterfell's yard became a grim haven, a last bastion of life against the encroaching dead. Eddard arranged for temporary shelters, though space grew tighter each day. The tension was palpable, men muttered, women wept, children stared blankly at the walls as though expecting the dead to walk in at any moment. Late in the afternoon, another company arrived, men from House Serwyn, led by a somber older knight named Ser Bartimus. They had fought off a small pack of whites on the road with the aid of newly forged winter steel. Ser Bartimus bore a deep cut on his cheek that had partially frozen in the cold. Yet he carried with him a resolute sense of purpose. He presented Eddard with an inventory of arms they had managed to forge under Micken's instructions, mostly swords and some maces with black steel heads. As they spoke in the courtyard, Eddard noted how the other men looked to him with something like reverence. The forging was not just a practical matter anymore, it had become the stuff of legends in the making, a new chapter in the North's long history. And Eddard uncomfortably found himself at the heart of it. That evening, Eddard convened another short meeting in the Great Hall to hear updates from the new arrivals. Exhaustion weighed on everyone, but they pressed on. Lady Mormont shared how her scouts had discovered an old watchtower near the western coast that had become infested with whites. The Bear Island warriors had purged it, setting the place ablaze, but it cost them lives. The Greyjohn reported that Last Hearth was expecting an assault soon, as the others seemed to test each stronghold one by one. Roose Bolton's men, according to rumor, had remained mostly within the Dreadfort, forging steel but not venturing far to aid the smaller holdfasts. Eddard frowned at that, suspecting that Bolton's aloofness might become a problem if the others turned their attention to the eastern flank. They discussed sending a contingent to the Dreadfort to ensure Bolton was doing his part, but for now, resources were stretched thin. Eddard decided a formal summons would go out to Roose Bolton, requesting he muster at least a portion of his forces to assist the Night's Watch near the eastern side of the wall. The Dreadfort was a strategic location for that route. If the others bypassed the wall or found hidden passes, the entire eastern north could be in jeopardy. The letter would be polite but firm, playing on Bolton's sense of self-preservation. Eddard wanted him involved, not lurking in the shadows. Still, Eddard braced himself for the possibility that House Bolton might choose to pursue its own interests even in the face of the undead threat. Night descended once more, bringing an eerie calm. The men on the walls carried torches and winter steel arms, peering into the swirling snow for any sign of movement. Eddard, climbing to the ramparts to survey the land, felt a sudden hush in the air. His breath crystallized. The snows had paused, leaving a frosted expanse beneath a sky full of stars. For a moment it was almost beautiful, the moonlight illuminating Winterfell's battlements, the white fields beyond. The wind carried the distant howl of a lone wolf. Eddard's hand rested on Ice's pommel, the cold leather pressing into his glove. This was his duty, standing vigil, ensuring that if the others came, they would face ready defenders. Every sense in him was alert, straining for any flicker of blue eyes in the darkness. Dawn broke without incident. Eddard permitted himself a brief relief. The lull gave them time to bury or burn the dead, to patch the holes in the gates, to reorganize weapon stockpiles. The forging never ceased. The clang of hammers on hot metal echoed in every corner of the north, or so the ravens reported. At White Harbor, new forges had been built in haste. Manderley's ships had also begun carrying shipments of black ore, rumored to come from meteorites from the far northern reaches. One rumor said that Manderley had even found a fresh source of dragon glass in a hidden cove, which might further bolster their arsenal. Eddard approved quietly. If the legends were true, dragon glass, like Valyrian steel, could harm the others. Every advantage might matter when the final confrontation came. Yet the uneasy question remained, where was King Robert in all this? Where were the southern lords? Rumors filtered up that the Iron Throne doubted the severity of the situation, or that Queen Cersei was convinced the North exaggerated the danger to hide a rebellion. Eddard seethed at that notion but forced himself to remain calm. He penned letter after letter, detailing the battles, urging the crown to send aid, soldiers, resources, anything to help. Each time, the responses were tepid at best, citing the difficulties of the realm's finances, the unrest in the Riverlands, the crown's reluctance to overcommit. Eddard suspected the Lannisters saw more to gain in letting the North bleed than in uniting to fight an enemy they still refused to believe in. If the South was blind, the North would simply have to see to its own survival. Eddard thought often of Jon Snow at the Wall, among the Black brothers who would be the first line of defense if the others sought to pass the ice. Eddard's heart clenched at the thought of his son in such peril. But he also knew Jon was safe among the men who most understood the threat. Eddard sent additional near Valyrian swords and spear tips to Castle Black, along with instructions on forging techniques. By now, enough blacksmiths had been trained that the Night's Watch could maintain its own small forging operation. Winter wore on, bringing deeper cold and more frequent blizzards. The roads became nearly impossible to traverse. Some small villages vanished entirely beneath snowdrifts, with no sign of life. Rumors said the others had scoured them, raising the dead for their ranks. Every day, Eddard braced for the horn blasts, for the ravens that cried of another attack. Scouts reported roving bands of whites in the forests, raiding abandoned farmland. But the massive assault everyone feared, the unstoppable wave of the undead, had not yet come. The watchers on the wall saw no such legion approaching. It was as if the others were slowly testing, expanding their domain in pockets, building strength. Thus, Eddard resolved that the North must do more than wait. On a bitter morning, beneath a sky of knife-edged clouds, he assembled a host in Winterfell's courtyard. He addressed them in a clear, steady voice, his breath streaming white in the cold air. We cannot sit idle within these walls, waiting for the others to pick us apart. We will ride north, cleanse the wolf's wood of whites, and secure a line of defense nearer the wall. If the main host of the others marches, we shall be in position to meet it, not cower behind stone. Every man here carries the black steel that can shatter the cold. Let us show the dead that the North does not fear them. A roar of approval rose from the crowd. The great Jon Umber slapped his breastplate, eager for another chance to test his axe on undead skulls. Robb stood at Eddard's side, calm but resolved. He had insisted on leading part of the cavalry. Lady Mormont pledged her warriors, grim-faced daughters and nieces among them. Even Glover's men, weary from the road, found new determination in the prospect of carrying the fight to the enemy. They all knew the risks. The White Walkers were no ordinary foe. But better to strike first than allow the whites to multiply unchecked. By mid-morning, the column marched out of Winterfell's gates. Eddard rode at the forefront with Robb. The wind whipped Eddard's cloak, carrying with it a chill that cut to the bone. He glanced back at the ranks of Northmen, spears upright, black steel sword hilts glinting in the pale sun. Horses snorted, their breath steaming. The snow underfoot was hard-packed. They moved steadily, a grim line of resolution on the white fields. Behind them, Winterfell's walls receded, flags fluttering, the final bastion they would return to if they returned at all. They traversed the Wolf's Wood, the ancient forest of tall pines and oaks draped in layers of snow. The hush within that woodland was uncanny, as though every branch and trunk held its breath. Men exchanged uneasy looks, gripping weapons tighter. Occasionally, a raven cawed or a distant crack of ice echoed. The scouts ranged ahead, then signaled the main host to proceed. No whites appeared at first, though tracks in the snow suggested that small packs had passed through recently. Eddard kept the formation tight. If the whites attacked from all sides, they needed a shield wall that could close ranks instantly. On the second day, they encountered the first real threat. Late in the afternoon, as the pale sun sank behind the treetops, the forward scouts rode back in a hurry. "A clearing up ahead, my lord," said one, breath quick. "We saw shapes, bodies scattered. Could be a trap." Then we glimpsed something moving among the trees. Eddard gathered his commanders. "We'll approach cautiously. Archers on the flanks. Swordsmen in the center. Be ready for an ambush." They advanced into the clearing, an oval space where the snow lay undisturbed save for lumps and ridges, as though something had been hurriedly covered. Robb raised a hand, halting the column. Silence pressed in, broken only by the shuffle of hooves. Then, with shocking suddenness, the lumps of snow moved. Rotten hands thrust through the crust of ice as whites pulled themselves from shallow pits. They rose in grotesque unity. Men, women, even half-frozen children, all animated by the cold will of the others. At least 3 dozen. Their eyes burned with otherworldly luminescence in the twilight. "Form ranks," Eddard shouted. The men tightened, raising near Valyrian swords and spears. Archers fumbled to notch arrows. The whites rushed forward in uneven jerks, some carrying rusted tools, others wielding broken blades. Across the clearing, the sound of snapping branches announced more whites skulking from the tree line. A classic pincer move, Eddard thought. The others were learning to use even rudimentary tactics. Yet the Northmen had prepared. Archers loosed volleys of flaming shafts, setting the closest whites ablaze. The creatures screamed, a ghastly sound that mingled with the crackle of burning flesh. The main column braced, near Valyrian spear tips gleaming. Eddard drew ice, hearing the faint hum of the ancient blade. He steadied his horse, waiting until the whites came within range, then spurred forward with a rallying cry. Robb charged on his left, sword raised. The clash was savage. Whites flung themselves at the shield wall, but the black steel hacked them apart. Severed limbs continued to twitch on the ground until archers rained more fire down, consuming the thrashing fragments. Eddard reined in close to a cluster of the dead, swinging ice in broad arcs. Heads tumbled, torsos collapsed in blackened gore. Each kill required a decisive blow, for even a partial white could remain dangerous. The reek of death hung over the clearing. From the trees, a figure emerged on a pale horse, a white walker, its silhouette tall and spidery, frost clinging to its hair. It bore a spear of ice that glimmered ominously in the fading light. Eddard felt the sudden drop in temperature, saw the puffs of breath around the men intensify. "Walker!" someone yelled. Immediately, a group of near Valyrian swordsmen rushed to intercept. The walker slid from its horse with inhuman grace, thrusting its spear at the first man to approach. The spear tore through a shield as though it were parchment, and the man died with a rasping cry, the life freezing in his eyes. But then more black-bladed swords closed in. One warrior, Eddard recognized him as Donnell Locke, lunged at the walker's flank. The walker whirled, parried with its spear, but the near Valyrian blade bit along the spear's haft, sending a spray of icy shards flying. The walker hissed, that otherworldly sound that set men's teeth on edge. The warrior attacked again, his sword swirling with black ripples in the torchlight. The creature twisted away unnaturally fast, but another Northman darted in from the opposite side, slashing at its legs. Trapped between them, the walker lashed out with a cold fury. One man screamed as ice raked across his arm, but the second blow struck home, cutting the walker's torso in a diagonal slash. The creature shattered into glittering fragments. A hiss of cold air rushed outward, and it was gone. The whites, as if sensing their master's destruction, faltered. Arrows and swords finished the rest. When the last shambling corpse collapsed, the clearing fell silent, save for the crackle of dying flames. Men leaned against spears, panting. Horses stamped nervously. Eddard surveyed the aftermath, noting injuries among his forces. They had fared well, but the walker had claimed at least a few lives. 2 men lay pale on the snow, eyes open to the sky, frost creeping across their armor. Eddard closed his eyes for a moment, murmuring a prayer. Then he set about organizing the burnings. No white could remain unburned. They continued deeper into the Wolf's Wood over the next few days, encountering more pockets of whites. Each battle tested their readiness, but each victory reaffirmed the value of near Valyrian steel and disciplined tactics. No longer did men quake at the sight of a walker, though fear was ever present. They had learned these beings could die if faced with the black steel that the North had labored so fiercely to create. At night, they made camp in tight formation, ringed by watchfires. Eddard forced himself to sleep in short, fitful stretches, always half expecting an attack in the dark. His dreams were haunted by images of white walkers drifting across a wasteland of ice, dragging behind them the corpses of men he had known. At one such encampment, Robb joined his father by the central fire. The swirling embers reflected on the underside of the branches overhead, creating a flicker of light across both their faces. Robb's eyes were somber. "I never imagined war like this. Fighting men is one thing, but these creatures, they don't feel pain and they don't yield." Eddard nodded, stirring the embers with a stick. "War against the living is bitter enough. War against the dead is something else. But you've acquitted yourself well, Robb. I see how you lead your men, how you plan your attacks. You do our house proud." Robb let out a shaky breath, looking older than his years. "I only wish we could protect everyone. The refugees we've passed, the children. It's worse than any story." "It is," Eddard admitted. "But we do what we can. The North stands because of men and women like you, like our bannermen, who refuse to bow to the long night." Robb fell silent. A moment later, a messenger approached the fire, looking anxious. "My lord, we've had a raven from Winterfell. Lady Mormont's scouts report a significant force of whites moving southwest, possibly toward White Harbor. Lord Manderley has sounded the alarm. He asks for aid." Eddard's expression hardened. White Harbor was vital as the North's principal port and largest city. If it fell, the forging operation there and the supply lines might be lost. Worse yet, thousands of innocent people lived in White Harbor's walls. How large a force did they see? "Hard to say, my lord. Possibly hundreds, with 1 or more White Walkers leading." "Then we must ride," Eddard said. "If we let them breach White Harbor, it could spread devastation across the entire eastern coast." Robb nodded immediately. "We can't leave the Wolf's Wood undefended, but maybe a portion of our host can continue rooting out whites here while the rest moves east." Eddard considered. "Yes. The Great John is eager for the fight. We can leave him and a small contingent to hold the Wolf's Wood. I'll take the bulk of our forces to White Harbor. You'll come with me, Robb. We have to show we stand with Manderley." They arranged it swiftly. The Great John, face split by a fierce grin, agreed to remain in the Wolf's Wood, culling any stray whites or small walker groups that ventured south. He boomed that he would keep the forest clear as my own head, which earned a chuckle from the men around him. Meanwhile, Eddard and Robb and about 2,000 Northmen turned their column east. They made haste, crossing snow-laden hills and half-frozen streams, forging onward despite the punishing wind. The days grew shorter still, the nights longer, as though the sun itself were retreating before the power of the long night. Even traveling light, it took the better part of a week to reach the vicinity of White Harbor. The city, once bustling with trade and sea traffic, lay muted under a blanket of snow. The wide White Knife River, which gave the place its name, was partially frozen along the banks. Manderley's banners fluttered on the walls, though in place of the usual lively harbor crowds, Eddard saw only shuttered buildings and men with near Valyrian spears manning barricades. The gates opened to admit them, and inside, the sight of the once thriving city in such a subdued state struck Eddard's heart. Streets that should have been filled with merchants and fishmongers were all but deserted, save for patrols of grim-faced soldiers. Lord Wyman Manderley himself, significantly thinner than before, no doubt from stress and the rationing of these dire times, greeted Eddard in the courtyard of Newcastle, the Manderley seat within White Harbor. Snow clung to the thick fur collar around Manderley's neck, and his once jolly expression was a mask of worry. "My Lord Stark," he said, bowing low. "Grateful to see you. We have sightings of the dead not more than a day's march to the north. The city folk are terrified." Eddard clasped the man's hand. "We came as soon as we heard." "How many men can you muster?" Manderley sighed heavily, fatigue evident in his eyes. "I've armed nearly every able-bodied man with the winter steel we've been forging. We have about 3,000 within the walls, plus more in the outlying manors, but they're scattered. If the horde arrives in full force, I can't guarantee our outer defenses will hold. Robb looked at the city's thick walls, the parapets lined with archers. Walls are high though. If the whites try to climb, we can pour flaming oil or volleys of arrow fire. Still, if there are white walkers, they may find a way to breach if we're not careful. Manderly nodded grimly. We've stockpiled barrels of oil and pitch. Our forges are still working day and night, turning out swords, arrowheads, anything we can manage. But my resources are stretched thin, food especially. More refugees arrive each day from the countryside, and we can't feed them all indefinitely. Eddard placed a hand on Manderly's broad shoulder. We'll do what we must, my friend. If necessary, we can evacuate some folk south. For now, show me the city's defenses and we'll plan for the confrontation. Manderly led them along the walls, explaining that he had prepared multiple fallback positions. If the outer gate was lost, men could retreat to an inner wall near the docks and from there to the ships if all else failed. Eddard approved of the layered defense but hoped it wouldn't be necessary to abandon half the city. He also saw how the wharfs and quays were nearly deserted of ships. Some had been sent on supply runs to Eastwatch by the sea, aiming to assist the Night's Watch. Others had been lost to storms in the winter seas. White Harbor's famed trade had all but collapsed. They paused at a vantage point overlooking the White Knife, the broad river half-choked with ice floes. Manderly gestured to the horizon. The whites approach from that direction, they say, likely crossing the shallower parts of the river. My scouts report at least a few hundred, led by 1 or 2 white walkers, but the numbers could be more if they merge with other groups. Eddard's mouth drew into a tight line. Then we must meet them before they reach the walls. If we can intercept them in open terrain, we'll have room for our cavalry and archers to strike. Robb nodded. We risk letting them bypass us in smaller groups if we move too far out, but better that than letting them besiege the city directly. That night, they convened with Manderly's officers to finalize a plan. At dawn, Eddard would lead a force out of the gates, forming a defensive line near a frozen stretch of river upstream. They would force the undead to fight on open ground. Archers and spearmen on the flanks, cavalry in reserve to charge once the whites were engaged. Another group would remain inside the walls under Manderly's command, ready to reinforce or cover a retreat if the battle turned ill. Bonfires, barrels of pitch, and rows of sharpened stakes would provide further obstacles to the undead. When Eddard emerged from the council, he found the sky clouded over once more, the faint moonlight barely illuminating the courtyard. He gazed up at the battlements, seeing watchfires flickering. Snow drifted in swirling eddies around the high towers. There was a terrible beauty to it, a hush that spoke of impending violence. He reminded himself that this was the duty of the Starks, to stand against the cold, come what may. He visited the forges in White Harbor briefly, where exhausted smiths hammered away at the black steel. The air in the foundry was a choking mix of coal smoke and heated metal. Manderly introduced him to an old Myrish smith who claimed to have studied remnants of Valyrian forging techniques across the sea. The man bowed, explaining in broken Westerosi that he was proud to help the North's cause. Eddard thanked him, acknowledging how those fragments of knowledge had proven invaluable. It heartened him to see cooperation across backgrounds, united by the dire threat of the others. At dawn, the gates rumbled open and Eddard's host rode out onto the plain. Robb was by his side, along with 2,000 men from Winterfell's column plus 1,000 of Manderly's best. The rest manned the walls, crossbows at the ready. The wind stung their cheeks as they advanced toward the bank of the White Knife where Manderly's scouts had last seen the undead. They found a wide, flat area where the river curved, partially frozen in the center. The ice looked treacherous but likely passable by the whites, which feared no drowning or cold water. Eddard positioned his men in a crescent formation, the center anchored by infantry with black spears, the flanks studded with archers. Great braziers had been dragged out, filled with coals and pitch to set the battlefield alight if needed. The morning light was ghostly and thin. A hush fell over the assembled ranks. Breath plumed from men and horses. Robb rode to each position, ensuring the lines were set. Eddard remained near the center. An ominous silence lay over the frozen river. Then, as the sun crept higher, they saw distant movement, shapes emerging from the far bank. A line of whites, staggering and jerking, hundreds strong. Some wore the remnants of peasant garb, others had rusted mail, a few looked like drowned sailors with seaweed clinging to them. Behind them, 2 tall figures on pale horses, white walkers. The others were here. A ripple of fear passed through the northern lines, but the men did not break. They had seen whites before, had fought them, and knew that the black steel gave them a fighting chance. Eddard raised his sword. Archers, stand ready. The first rank of archers notched arrows wrapped in oil-soaked cloth. Runners with torches hurried by, lighting each arrow in turn. Robb called out from the left flank, "Loose," and a volley of flaming arrows arced into the slate-gray sky, falling among the approaching dead. Several wights collapsed in burning heaps. But still they came, trudging over the frozen river, unmindful of flame. Another volley. More wights fell. Some crawled forward even while aflame, hissing. The White Walkers in the rear watched impassively. Eddard could almost feel their icy contempt as though they mocked the living's attempt to resist. His teeth clenched. "Spears brace," he roared. The men lowered their near Valyrian spear tips, black gleaming in the early light, forming a hedge of lethal points. The wights hit the formation, limbs flailing. They threw themselves onto the spears, many impaled. A few staggered sideways, pulling themselves free with undead strength. The shield wall held firm, men thrusting with their black-tipped weapons, severing limbs and heads. Arrows continued to rain down. The stench of burning flesh thickened the air. Eddard rode along the line, shouting encouragement, hacking any wights that slipped past the spears. The clang of steel on bone, the screams of men, and the hisses of the undead merged into a cacophony of horror. Then the White Walkers themselves glided forward, their horses stepping lightly on the ice. One brandished a sword of crystallized ice, the other a curved blade that glowed with a faint blue luminescence. They advanced upon the left flank where Robb commanded. Eddard heard shouts and curses from that direction. He spurred his horse, plunging toward the conflict. Through the press of men and wights, he glimpsed Robb, sword raised, confronting one of the walkers. The creature's blade flashed in a swirl of frost, parrying Robb's strike and sending a wave of cold that frosted Robb's gauntlet. Eddard urged his horse faster, cutting down a wight that lunged for him. The walker turned as if sensing his presence, and Eddard felt the air temperature plummet even more. He swung ice in a hard downward arc at the walker's flank. The creature twisted with impossible grace, blocking with its icy sword. The collision sent a shower of shimmering fragments across the snow, the ring of Valyrian steel against enchanted ice echoing. Eddard gritted his teeth, muscles straining. Robb attacked from the other side, black sword biting into the walker's thigh. The creature hissed, a high-pitched screech that rattled men's bones. Working in tandem, father and son pressed their advantage. The walker was quick, but they were two, each armed with near Valyrian steel. Sparks of frost and black metal flew as swords clashed. Finally, Robb feinted a high cut. The walker raised its blade, leaving a split-second opening in its guard. Eddard lunged, ice piercing the creature's abdomen. A sound like cracking ice split the air, and the walker's tall form shattered into shards that dissolved into the snow. Robb stumbled back, gasping, his face pale from the cold aura. Eddard grabbed his shoulder. "Are you hurt?" Robb shook his head. "Just cold." "Thank you, father." His breath ragged, but relief in his eyes. They looked around. The second walker had engaged a knot of Manderly warriors. Their black steel scythes and swords flailed against it, but the walker moved with balletic speed, parrying or shattering lesser weapons. Then Lady Mormont arrived, roaring like a bear. She brought down her black-bladed axe upon the walker's arm, severing it. The creature screeched, staggering. A second blow cleaved it diagonally, and it too disintegrated in a flurry of icy shards. The men let out a ragged cheer. Without the guiding will of the walkers, the mass of wights lost coordination. They continued to press forward, but in a more haphazard manner, easier to cut down. Eddard signaled for the cavalry. Horses thundered across the field, riders slashing and trampling the undead. Flames from the archers further decimated their ranks. Within half an hour, the last wight had been split apart or burned. Silence fell over the battlefield except for the crackle of dying fires and the groans of the wounded. Eddard dismounted, exhaustion coursing through his limbs. The stench of death was everywhere, bodies strewn across the frozen ground, black steel glinting in the morning sun. Another victory, but how many more would it take? How many men had they lost here to preserve White Harbor? He could not say, but at least the city stood. He spotted Manderly's banners in the distance, men waving them in cautious triumph. The North had once again proven that unity and winter steel could defeat the undead. But each fight came at a cost, and Eddard feared that the largest battles were yet to be fought. He oversaw the grim task of burning the white corpses. Pits were dug, logs thrown in, corpses stacked. The flames rose, black smoke coiling into the sky. Some men retched at the sight, others stood silent, lost in thought. Eddard approached Robb, who was leaning on his sword, breathing heavily. He saw that his son's fingertips were blistered from the cold that had crawled up his gauntlet. "You should see a maester about that," Eddard said. Robb nodded absently, gaze on the pyre. "I will. Is it always like this? Fighting the others?" "As far as I've seen, yes. We have to take comfort in small victories. Rob's eyes flicked to the swirling smoke. I just wish there were a way to end this once and for all. Eddard clasped his shoulder. Perhaps if the legends are true and the Night King himself is somewhere beyond the wall, it's his power that drives them. If we could find him, strike him down, maybe we could break their hold on the dead. But we have only rumors to guide us. Then we'll make do with what we have, Rob said, steeling himself. They regrouped at White Harbor. Wounded men helped back behind the walls for care, the dead lined up for final rites. Wyman Manderley greeted them with gratitude, though his face was grim when he learned the toll. We'll hold White Harbor as long as we can, he vowed, placing one meaty hand on Eddard's arm. Your forging technique has saved us again. If only the rest of the realm would listen. Eddard sighed. I've sent ravens south at every turn. The crown remains hesitant. But we must persist. If the others move in greater numbers, they won't stop at the neck. And by then, it may be too late. Manderley offered them rest in his castle, but Eddard refused to linger too long. Other parts of the north needed his oversight. He did stay a few days to ensure the city's defenses were fully prepared to help sort out rationing for the refugees pouring in from the countryside. He arranged for Rob to rest and see to his injuries. In that span, ravens arrived with scattered reports. The Grey John still patrolled the Wolfswood, dispatching small pockets of whites. House Glover had spotted more undead near Deepwood Motte but handled them. The Night's Watch sent word of skirmishes near Eastwatch. And still, no sign of the rumored massive horde. It was as though the others were content to strike in smaller forces, testing weaknesses. Yet Eddard knew the calm would not last. Winter deepened by the day, and legends said the long night would come with a near-endless black sky and storms of relentless cold. He felt it in his bones, the gathering threat. So he left White Harbor in the capable hands of Manderley and with 200 men, rode west, determined to check on other holdfasts. On the journey, they passed farmland lying fallow, blanketed in snowdrifts. Crows circled overhead, sometimes feasting on bodies half buried in ice. In some places, they found small bands of survivors who approached warily, begging for food or shelter. Eddard gave what aid he could, directing them toward White Harbor or Winterfell. The small folks' eyes gleamed with desperate hope when they saw the black steel swords. Word had traveled that these weapons could kill the dead. Eddard tried to reassure them, though in truth he had no certain promise to offer except to keep fighting. Eventually, the column reached a minor castle belonging to House Riswell, known for its horse herds. There, Eddard discovered the gates barred and the walls manned by nervous guards. After some calling and revealing his identity, they lowered the drawbridge. Inside, the courtyard was a dismal sight, a group of peasants huddled around a single brazier, ice-sunken. The hold's lord, a tired man named Roland Riswell, greeted Eddard, explaining that whites had swarmed the outlying villages. The Riswells had tried forging near Valyrian steel as instructed, but lacked skilled smiths, so only a handful of swords had been produced. Many of their men had died or fled. The stables, once full of horses, stood half empty. Roland pleaded for more blacksmiths, more weapons. Eddard frowned, wishing he had the resources to spare. As it stood, every blacksmith in the north was working day and night, stretched to capacity. Still, he promised to send a raven to Winterfell for any skilled smith that might be dispatched. In the meantime, he left Roland with half a dozen near Valyrian spears from his own wagon and some basic instructions on forging from scraps of meteorite iron. It was not nearly enough, but it was all Eddard could do. They rode onward, the roads growing rougher, occasionally blocked by fallen trees or drifted snow that required hours of labor to clear. Along the way, they stumbled upon the remnants of a caravan, presumably refugees. Torn tents, overturned wagons, and frozen corpses indicated an attack. White footprints crisscrossed the area, and there was no sign of survivors. Eddard supervised the grim search for any who might still breathe. They found none. With a heavy heart, they burned the bodies, consigning them to fire before the others could raise them again. In this manner, week followed week. Eddard moved from holdfast to holdfast, reinforcing defenses, delivering what meager weapons and forging knowledge he could, rallying the local lords to remain vigilant. His own force, though tired, was an inspiration to the smaller houses, for the men bore the black steel that had proven so effective. More than once, whites ambushed them in the dead of night, but each time, the northern steel and well-drilled formations repelled the undead. Sometimes Eddard caught glimpses of pale figures in the distance, White Walkers observing, perhaps measuring the men's strength. They rarely engaged unless they saw an advantage. Eddard felt a growing certainty that these skirmishes were part of a larger strategy. The others were not mindless, they moved with dark cunning, as though waiting for the perfect moment to strike a decisive blow. At last, Eddard turned his column back toward Winterfell, for the supplies and morale of his men were near the breaking point. The final leg of the journey was fraught with blizzards so thick that they had to camp for days in the lee of rock outcroppings, building great fires just to stay alive. Horses perished in the cold, men succumbed to frostbite, and rations ran low. Yet they pressed on. When finally the towers of Winterfell rose on the horizon half buried in snow, Eddard felt a surge of relief. Many of the men cheered faintly. Winterfell's gates opened, revealing a fortress that had become a bustling bastion of refugees, soldiers, and blacksmiths. Smoke curled from multiple chimneys, the smell of coal and iron in the air. Robb was there to greet his father, eyes full of concern as he saw the weary state of the returning column. Eddard dismounted, stiff from the cold, and embraced his son. Around them, stable hands took the horses, men stumbled toward the fires or the maesters for treatment. Eddard nodded gratefully at Robb. "It's good to be back. Has there been any word of a major assault?" Robb shook his head. "No. Only scattered reports like before. We've kept forging and we're training what men we can. Food is getting scarce though. We're rationing carefully. I'm worried, father. If the winter grows worse, we'll be in dire straits." Eddard sighed, running a gloved hand over his tired face. "Then we must look at our stores, see who among the refugees can help in the fields if any farmland remains workable. Though it seems unlikely in this cold. We might have to hunt more aggressively in the forests, though that carries risk with whites about." Robb nodded, grimly accepting. "You should rest. Then we can discuss next steps with the lords." Howland Reed arrived yesterday bearing tidings of strange events in the neck. "Howland Reed?" Eddard said, a spark of curiosity cutting through his fatigue. "That's good. I'd like to speak with him." Robb led Eddard to the great hall, which was crowded with men and women seeking warmth, its high ceiling hazy with smoke from the roaring fire. The noise of conversations, arguments, and pleas for aid washed over them. Eddard made his way to the dais, where a group of northern lords stood in intense discussion. Among them he saw the slight, wiry figure of Howland Reed, wearing his trademark frog spear strapped across his back, a swamp-green cloak around his shoulders. Reed's face lit up when he spotted Eddard, and they clasped hands. "Ned," Reed said, using the familiar address they'd shared since the days of Robert's rebellion. "You look as though you wrestled a polar bear. Sit, please. Have some hot wine." Eddard sank into a chair, grateful for the warmth of the fire. "I've been traveling the north, seeing how our forging project has fared, how the holdfasts stand. It's worse than I feared, Howland. But we've managed to fend off the worst so far. You've brought news." Reed inclined his head. "Yes. The neck has its own share of whites, creeping through the bogs. My people have fought them off with near Valyrian arrowheads and some cunning traps. But there's something else. Rumors of old magic stirring in the swamps. Crannog witches speak of unnatural lights beneath the water, odd whispers at night. I can't make sense of it yet, but it's reminiscent of the tales of the children of the forest." Eddard leaned forward. "The children of the forest, do you think they still exist in the deep recesses of the neck?" Reed shrugged lightly. "If they do, they're as reclusive as ever. Or perhaps it's just the echo of old enchantments. Nonetheless, I felt it prudent to warn you. The last time the others walked, the children fought alongside men. If they're awake, or if some remnant of their power stirs, it may be an omen." Eddard absorbed that, feeling a faint flicker of hope. Any ally, human or otherwise, might be crucial if the others attacked in force. Yet he knew better than to rely on ancient legends. "Thank you. Keep me informed. If you can gather more intelligence, please do so." Reed nodded, sipping from a horn of mulled wine. As they spoke, a runner approached, breathless. "My lord, a raven from the Night's Watch. They say a large host of whites has been spotted beyond the wall, heading for the bridge at Skirling Pass. The Lord Commander begs for reinforcements." Eddard stood, heart pounding. Skirling Pass was one of the lesser-known routes around the wall, treacherous and ice-choked, but if a large host used it and succeeded, they could outflank the watch entirely. "So the others are testing the wall from multiple angles," he muttered. "We must respond. Gather the lords." The runner bowed and hurried off. Robb stepped forward. "We could muster those men who are still fresh. Perhaps 2,000, 3 at most. But the journey to Skirling Pass is long and perilous." Eddard exhaled slowly, measuring the risk. So many places needed defending, but the wall was paramount. If the others swept around it, the entire north could be surrounded. "We have no choice. The watch is undermanned. The pass is not heavily defended. We go." He turned to Howland Reed. "Will you stand with us?" Reed nodded. "The Crannogmen will do what we can. Though the swamps won't matter if the others come pouring in from the far north." Eddard gave him a grateful nod, then looked to the other lords. "I ask all who can ride with me. We'll leave enough garrison here at Winterfell to protect the refugees. Lady Mormont, the Umbers, any who can muster a force quickly. His gaze traveled over the faces in the hall. Some men looked weary to the point of collapse, but no one voiced dissent. They understood the stakes. In times past, the North might have questioned risking so many men far from home. But these were not ordinary times. Preparations began at once. Maesters circulated, listing the supplies needed. The blacksmiths rushed to finalize more near Valyrian spears and arrowheads. Eddard dispatched ravens to the neighboring holds, calling them to a final muster at Winterfell. Skirling Pass was hardly a place for a pitched battle, but if the others forced it, a significant confrontation might be unavoidable. Eddard lay awake that night in his solar, listening to the wind moan outside the walls. He missed the relative innocence of years past, when his greatest worries had been lords squabbling or the crown's demands. Now, the survival of the living itself hung by a thread. Dawn came, bleak and cold. The mustering ground outside Winterfell's gates filled with hundreds of men, horses stamping restlessly in the snow. The Great John had returned from the Wolfswood upon receiving the Raven, eager for a grand fight. Houses Serwyn, Tallheart, Glover, even some from Bolton's lands, arrived in smaller contingents. Lady Mormont brought a cadre of fierce warriors. Together, they formed a column of approximately 3,000, all armed with a mix of black steel swords, spears, and arrowheads. It was a testament to how much forging the North had accomplished that so many could carry near Valyrian arms. Eddard felt a spark of pride amidst the dread. The North had done the impossible, forging new steel to match the horrors of the long night. Leaving Winterfell behind once more, the column struck north. The journey to Skirling Pass would be harrowing, crossing icy foothills and wind-lashed plateaus. Along the way, more men joined from smaller houses, swelling the ranks slightly. They moved with purpose, the horns sounding their advance, banners flapping in the relentless wind. Eddard wondered if this would be the decisive confrontation. The others clearly sought a route around the wall. If they broke through in large numbers, the entire realm might be lost. But if the North held firm and shattered them at the pass, perhaps the others would be forced back into the frozen wastes. Days blurred into one another. They waded through waist-deep snow, hacked through ice-covered brush, endured nights of savage blizzards. More than once, wolves howled eerily in the distance, echoing the howls of winter. Some men succumbed to frostbite despite layering themselves in furs. Eddard pressed them onward. The cause was too important to falter. Robb worked tirelessly, urging the men to build better shelters at night to keep watch fires burning. Howland Reed scouted ahead with his Crannogmen, using their swamp-bred stealth to find passable routes. The Great John kept everyone's spirits high with loud boasts of how he would tear a White Walker's head off with his bare hands. At last, the terrain rose sharply into a series of jagged ridges battered by unceasing winds. There, before them, lay Skirling Pass, a narrow defile choked with snowdrifts and overshadowed by icy crags. The Night's Watch had a small outpost high on a cliff above the pass, a watchtower that blinked torch signals at their approach. Eddard signaled back with a mirror in the weak sunlight. A party of black-clad brothers descended to meet them. Their leader, a tired sergeant named Dywin, explained that their rangers had spotted a massive white contingent approaching from the far side, possibly several thousand strong, accompanied by an unknown number of White Walkers. Eddard's heart sank at the numbers. Several thousand whites? That was the largest force he had heard of to date. Still, he maintained a steady composure. Then we hold this pass, he told Dywin. We have the men and the steel to do so. Dywin was less certain. Aye, we'll do what we can, my lord. The pass is narrow, but so are the vantage points. If the whites scale the ridges, they might outflank us. Be ready for them to come from above, not just the main route. Eddard nodded, turning to his assembled lords. We'll split into 3 groups. One to hold the main defile, one to climb the ridges on the east side, and one to hold the west side. We'll rely on signals. If any flank is overrun, we fall back in an orderly retreat, forcing them to fight on multiple fronts. No one breaks rank. Remember, near Valyrian steel and fire are our best weapons. Night fell as they established positions. The men dug hastily improvised trenches, stacked rocks for makeshift barricades, and set up braziers at intervals. Patrols were sent onto the ridges to keep watch. The shrieking wind made everything more difficult. Eddard worried that men might freeze in the night, but it was safer than being caught unawares. He decided that half the force would stand watch while the other half tried to snatch a few hours' sleep before the battle began. He himself could not sleep, pacing the pass with Robb at his side, listening to the mountains groan under the weight of ice. His mind churned with images of the undead legion approaching. Near midnight, the horn blasts came from the ridge scouts, 1, 2, 3 blasts. The sign of the others. Torches flared. Men scrambled to their positions. Eddard ran to a vantage point behind the main barricade. He peered down into the darkness of the pass. At first, he saw only whirling snow. Then, in a flash of moonlight, he saw them, a rolling tide of whites. More than he had ever imagined, an unending mass of rotted faces, skeletal limbs, tattered clothing, all advancing with grim inevitability. Behind them, luminous shapes that could only be white walkers mounted on pale horses, their eyes blazing with cold fire. A hush of terror gripped the men as the undead horde drew near. Eddard forced himself to speak calmly. "Archers, light arrows? Prepare the braziers." A line of archers drew back bowstrings, the flickering torchlight dancing on their determined faces. 10 seconds passed like hours. Then Eddard gave the command, "Loose." Flaming arrows streaked across the pass, cutting bright arcs in the night. They struck the front ranks of whites. Some collapsed, ablaze, but the bulk kept coming, trampling the fallen underfoot. Another volley. More whites fell. The pass was too narrow for them to spread out fully, which was to the defenders' advantage, but the sheer numbers pressed forward like a wave. Eddard shouted to the men manning the braziers. They appended them, sending cascades of flaming oil across the snow. Fire raced toward the horde, igniting dozens more. Still, they came on, unstoppable in their mindless search. At last, the undead crashed against the barricades. The front rank of the Northmen thrust with black steel spears, severing limbs and caving in rib cages. Whites tried to climb over their fallen, scrabbling at the wood and stone. The stench of decay and smoke filled the air. Eddard joined the front, slashing with ice, severing a white's arm, then another's head. Robb fought beside him, blade flashing. The men roared, a desperate wall of steel and courage holding back the avalanche of death. Suddenly, a shout came from the east ridge. Eddard glanced up to see shapes outlined against the moonlit sky, whites climbing precarious ledges, hooking fingers into cracks. Arrows peppered them, but not all fell. Some scrambled onto the ridge, attacking the men stationed there. Eddard yelled to the Great John, who commanded that flank, and heard the Great John's booming voice rallying his men. "Hack them apart, lads. Burn their carcasses." Flames leapt up on the ridge as men hurled torches at the climbing whites. Below, the main defile threatened to buckle under the pressure. The whites' mass was staggering. Eddard realized with dismay that the entire pass might be filled. The reek of burnt flesh and the sheer weight of numbers forced some men back. Eddard bellowed for the second rank to move forward, plugging any gaps. Swords rose and fell in a blur of near Valyrian ripples. The night air rang with the clang of steel, the shrieks of the undead, the gasps of the dying. Then, from behind the whites, the White Walkers advanced. Eddard made out at least 4 of them, an unprecedented number in one place. Each carried a weapon of ice. Their PR. Eason seemed to intensify the cold, making men's joints ache, breath turning to hoarfrost. One walker strode directly toward the barricade, trailing a mist of frost behind it. Men flinched away, fear roiling in their eyes. Eddard forced himself forward, brandishing ice. 2 other men with black steel swords tried to engage the walker first, attacking from the flank. The walker moved in a blur, parrying both blows with its icy blade. A burst of cold wind threw them back, stunned. Eddard seized the chance to strike from the other side, ice cutting in a diagonal arc. The walker turned, meeting the blade with a resounding crash of frost and steel. Sparks of cold light scattered. Eddard grunted, pushing with all his might, but the walker was unnaturally strong. It hissed, free hand swiping at him. Eddard ducked, feeling the rush of freezing air that raked along his scalp. He sidestepped and swung again, forcing the walker to pivot. One of the men behind it managed to stab with a near Valyrian spear. The tip pierced the walker's back, causing it to shriek and whirl, lashing out. The spear carrier's throat parted in a spray of blood. But the blow gave Eddard an opening to drive ice deep into the walker's torso. Another shriek, a sound that made the hair on men's necks stand. The walker exploded into shards, leaving Eddard gasping. He looked around for the other walkers. One had gone to the east ridge, from which the Great John's roars could still be heard. Another seemed to be advancing toward the west flank, invisible in the swirl of snow. The fourth. Eddard couldn't see. The pass was a maelstrom of flame and darkness. The whites pressed relentlessly, hundreds still crowding forward. A portion of the barricade gave way under their weight. Men stumbled back, forming a secondary line. Eddard cursed. If the whites broke through entirely, the men would be swarmed. He rallied the defenders, shouting for them to hold, to press forward with spears and axes. Torches were thrown, lighting new pockets of flame. The dead shrieked, yet more pushed from behind, unstoppable. Eddard's gaze swept the field, and he saw a figure on horseback weaving through the whites, cloaked in swirling frost. Another walker, different from the others, wearing what looked like shards of bone or ice shaped like a crown. A hush seemed to follow it as though it drew the darkness in. Men shrank away in terror, some dropping their swords. The crowned walker lifted a spear of pale crystal, pointing it at the defenders. Instantly, shards of ice rained down from the sky, stabbing into men who cried out in agony. Eddard's stomach lurched. This must be the Night King, or some lieutenant nearly as powerful. The stories said the Night King was the greatest among the others, commanding them all. If this was truly him, the pass might be lost. He spurred toward the figure, hacking through wights in his path, shouting for men to follow. Robb saw him and tried to join, but a knot of undead separated them. Eddard pressed on alone, heart hammering. If he could strike down this being, maybe the horde would waver. The crowned walker saw him coming, turned with a languid grace as though bored. Eddard felt the piercing cold of its gaze. He urged his horse to lunge forward, swinging ice. The walker raised its spear calmly, blocking with a crisp clang. The shock of impact nearly tore ice from Eddard's hands. He grit his teeth, struck again. The walker twisted aside, sending a wave of frost along the ground. The horse lost its footing, crashing to its side. Eddard rolled clear, tumbling in the snow. Wights lurched in, grabbing at his legs. He kicked them away, stabbing one with his dagger as he scrambled upright. In that moment, the crowned walker advanced. Eddard raised ice, but the creature's spear swept in a blur. Eddard parried, feeling an almost unbearable chill numb his arms. Another blow came, forcing him back a step. His vision swam with the swirl of snow and the glow of those inhuman eyes. A spike of dread coursed through him. He was good with a blade, but the walker's reflexes were beyond mortal. One misstep and he would be impaled on that spear. Still, Eddard mustered his resolve. The entire north depended on men like him not to yield. He feinted left, swung right, but the walker evaded. A vicious riposte sliced Eddard's cloak, narrowly missing his ribs. Frost crackled along the torn cloth. Eddard exhaled a ragged breath, focusing on each movement. He forced the walker into a pattern of strikes and parries, looking for an opening. But it was perfectly balanced, reading every shift. Another wave of ice shards rained down, courtesy of the walker's spear. Eddard braced, letting them crash into his upraised sword. Shards bounced off ice in a spray of cold sparks. Then the walker thrust, a lightning-fast stab aimed at Eddard's heart. He twisted desperately, feeling the spear graze his side, an explosion of numbing cold. He gasped in pain, dropping to one knee. Triumph gleamed in the walker's eyes as it raised the spear for a killing blow. Eddard grimaced, expecting death. But from the side, a roar sounded, Robb Stark charging in with a black-bladed sword. The walker spun, blocking at the last instant. Robb hammered blow after blow, forcing the creature away from Eddard. Gasping, Eddard tried to rise, ignoring the pain in his side. Robb fought with every ounce of skill and fury he possessed. The crowned walker parried, ice crystals swirling in a mini-storm around them. Father and son flanked it. Eddard thrust at its leg, forcing it to jerk away. Robb slashed high, drawing a line of frost-like blood across its shoulder. The walker hissed, the nearest wights converging to protect it. Eddard and Robb found themselves assaulted by half a dozen undead at once. Time blurred into a frenzy of sword arcs and rotted limbs. Eddard decapitated one wight, stabbed another through the spine. Robb kicked a third into the fire. But the walker moved behind its minions as though regrouping. Before Eddard could break through, the walker turned its mount. Somehow the horse had circled back, also undead, and galloped toward the rear of the white horde, disappearing into the writhing mass. Eddard almost gave chase, but two wights blocked him, snarling with blackened teeth. He dispatched them with swift cuts. When he looked again, the crowned figure was gone. He scanned the pass, hearing battles raging on all sides, seeing men locked in life-or-death struggles. The wights seemed endless. If the crowned walker was the Night King, it had no intention of dying here, not yet. Perhaps it withdrew to let the horde finish what it started. A deafening crack split the air. Eddard turned to see part of the ridge collapsing in an avalanche of snow and ice, burying wights and men alike. The Greyjourn's voice bellowed from somewhere in the chaos. Torches flickered, fell. The defenders near the barricade were being pushed back further, the line breaking in places. Eddard's heart twisted. It might be impossible to hold the pass indefinitely against such sheer numbers. They had inflicted terrible casualties on the undead, but still more pressed forward. He shouted for men to fall back to the second line. The horns blew in frantic bursts. Groups of Northmen pulled back, forming defensive circles, continuing to hack at the wights while retreating up a slight slope. Robb, battered and bleeding from a shallow cut on his shoulder, joined his father. "We can't hold here, father. We're being overrun." Eddard nodded grimly, eyes searching for any sign of a miracle. "We'll make a fighting retreat. Up the ridge." The narrower path might let fewer whites attack at once. Signal all units. We hold the high ground as long as we can. Runners were dispatched, calling to the men on the flanks. The defenders broke into smaller companies, each group fending off whites and retreating step by step. The pass became a killing field of swirling snow, bodies, and black steel glinting with each desperate blow. Men fought with the desperation of cornered wolves. More than once, a small knot of defenders was cut off and overwhelmed by the dead. Their screams echoed until they fell silent under the swarm. Others managed to regroup on rocky outcroppings, fending off the undead with flaming brands and spears. Eddard directed men to fallback positions where they had stacked fuel for fires. They lit them, scorching whites that came too close. Somehow, hours passed in this nightmarish struggle. The moon traveled across the sky, hidden by swirling clouds. The hiss of wind mingled with the shrieks of dying men and undead. Eddard lost track of how many times he swung ice, how many times he thought he would be pulled down by clawing hands. Robb was always near, fighting like a cornered direwolf, eyes blazing with defiance. The Great John reappeared at one point, his armor dented, brandishing a near Valyrian axe, leading a furious charge that cut a path through the whites on the eastern slope. Even with their valiant resistance, the defenders were slowly giving ground, inch by bloody inch. Eddard recognized that if dawn did not come soon, if the whites had no reason to halt, the Northmen might be slaughtered to a man. Another avalanche or cunning maneuver from the White Walkers could seal their fate. He felt the sting of despair creeping into his heart. They had done so much, forged so many swords, yet here they stood, outnumbered by a legion of the dead. Was this the end of their defiance? Then, in the midst of the chaos, a new sound erupted, a clarion call echoing off the cliffs. A horn blast, but not from the Night's Watch or the Northmen. It came from the west. Eddard looked to see torchlights moving in the darkness. An army approached from the flank, surging onto the battlefield with war cries. Banners snapped, though Eddard could not immediately make out their sigils. The newcomers crashed into the whites' flank, driving them back in confusion. The entire dynamic of the fight shifted. The undead, pressed from two sides, wavered. As the wave of reinforcements drew closer, Eddard recognized their banners with astonishment. They bore the golden kraken of House Greyjoy, the falcon of House Arryn, and even the lion of House Lannister. Dozens of southern banners interspersed with the crowned stag of King Robert. Was it truly the royal host? In that moment, Eddard recalled the ravens he had sent, the pleas for aid, and King Robert's earlier indifference. Yet here they were, late, but here nonetheless. The combined might of the southern houses had arrived at Skirling Pass, cutting through the whites in a sweeping flank maneuver. Eddard felt a surge of hope. He rallied his men to press forward again, meeting the undead in a pincer. The whites found themselves assaulted on two fronts, battered by the black steel of the north and the steel of the south. Among the southern host, Eddard glimpsed shining suits of armor, knights on powerful chargers, archers unleashing volley after volley. Some men fell to the whites, but the momentum was reversed. The wedge of southern cavalry carved into the horde, scattering ranks of the dead. Amid the swirling melee, Eddard spotted King Robert Baratheon himself, wielding a massive warhammer that glinted with cunningly inlaid black steel. So they had tried forging it as well. Perhaps pyromancers or blacksmiths in the capital had gleaned enough from rumors. Robert bellowed in that familiar, boisterous voice, smashing whites left and right, unmindful of the gore that spattered his cloak. Nearby rode Jaime Lannister, golden hair streaming, cutting down whites with a fine sword that might have been near Valyrian. Eddard could hardly believe the sight. The whites fought on mechanically, but leaderless now. Eddard sensed the White Walkers had withdrawn again, likely when they saw the tide turning. Without the walkers' direction, the whites simply lashed out at whatever was near. One by one, they were struck down, burned, or hacked apart by the combined forces. The pass was awash in carnage. The snow stained black-red in the faint starlight. Hour by hour, the defenders and the newly arrived southern host whittled down the undead. At last, the final white toppled, consumed by flame or shredded by black steel. A profound silence fell, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. When dawn finally broke, the battlefield revealed a grim tableau. Bodies of men from the north and south, intermingled with heaps of the dead, battered barricades, scorched earth. But they had held. Eddard found Robert near the center, leaning on his warhammer, sweat-soaked hair plastered to his brow. He looked older and heavier than Eddard remembered, but there was still fire in his eyes. They stared at each other across a patch of churned snow. Then Robert broke into a breathless laugh. stepping forward to clasp Eddard in a crushing embrace. "By the gods, Ned, you really have been fighting the dead up here," Robert said, panting. "Cersei's tongue was wagging that you plotted some rebellion, but old Pycelle and Varys finally convinced the council your letters might be true. I gathered what men I could, but storms slowed us. We nearly lost half the host crossing the neck. I see we arrived just in time." Eddard, weak with relief, nodded. "We thought ourselves forsaken, Robert. You have our thanks. This victory is yours as much as anyone's." Robert grimaced, looking around at the devastation. "A victory, yes, but a bloody one. There's no joy in slaying corpses. These damned others are real. 7 hells. What do we do now?" Eddard let out a long breath. "We bury the dead. Or burn them, rather. Then we regroup. The others remain at large, likely with the one who wears a crown of ice. If we can unite the realm, perhaps we can drive them back for good." Robert squared his shoulders. "Then we shall. Word of this will spread across all Westeros. No one can deny the threat now. I'll send ravens to every corner, demanding fealty and aid. The Lannisters, Tyrells, Martells. They'll have to join us or face the same fate we nearly did here." Eddard looked to the ridges, where men were already piling white corpses for burning. The stench rose in thick clouds. He saw Robb standing with the Great John, battered but alive, and felt a wave of gratitude. The forging of near Valyrian steel and the unity of the North had carried them this far. Now, perhaps, with the rest of the realm awakened to the threat, they had a chance to stave off the endless night. It would not be easy. The White Walkers had retreated, not been destroyed. But for the first time, Eddard sensed that the living might truly come together. King Robert was here, hammer in hand, ready to fight at the north side. Thus ended the Battle of Skirling Pass, a momentous clash that proved that, with the right weapons and the will to stand as one, men could face the others and survive. In the days to follow, the news would spread like wildfire through the kingdoms. Eddard Stark's forging of new Valyrian steel, black steel, was hailed as the cornerstone of the North's defense. Southern lords who once mocked the Starks' warnings now clamored for the precious knowledge, sending envoys begging for forging secrets and shipments of the special ore. The realm slowly realized that to triumph against the darkness, every sword arm must bear a blade that could cut through the cold. Still, the road ahead lay thick with perils. The crowned walker, whether the Night King or one of his lieutenants, remained alive. The others continued to spawn whites in the far northern wastes. No man could guess if they would attempt another route or if they might descend upon the wall directly in overwhelming force. Eddard knew the forging must continue, not just in the north, but across Westeros. They would need an entire army of near Valyrian blades to stand against the coming storm. Winter's chill was only deepening, and the final confrontation loomed closer with each passing day. For now, they had won a reprieve. Men from every corner of the 7 kingdoms, battered and bruised, stood side by side on that crimson-stained snow and gazed at the sunrise with equal parts awe and exhaustion. They had tested their mettle against the worst nightmares of legend, and they had not broken. Eddard Stark, leaning on ice, felt hope kindle in his chest. They had come this far guided by his determination to revive the secrets of Valyrian steel, by the steadfast loyalty of northern lords, and finally by the tardy but critical aid of the southern kings. This tenuous alliance might be enough to turn back the dead. If men could stand together, if they continued to hone their steel and strengthen their bonds, perhaps the long night would not fully descend upon the realm again. As the fires consumed the last heaps of whites and the wind scattered their ashes across the frosted peaks, the living emerged into a new dawn, tempered by hardship, united by necessity. Though the war against the others was far from ended, the forging of near Valyrian blades had lit a spark in the darkness, a tangible proof that the living could resist. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, had fulfilled his duty not only to the north but to all Westeros, and in the trials yet to come, that duty would continue to guide him. Honor and steel, loyalty and unity, these would be their watchwords as they faced whatever horrors the cold might unleash next. And in the stories told by hearth fires for generations to come, the songs would proclaim how Eddard Stark armed the north with a new breed of Valyrian steel, forging not only swords but the realm's last hope against the gathering night.